is a marrying of the ancient Near East with a modern understanding, and should that not make you go, then how could a human author write it like that, or design the text to be not only applicable to its original audience, but 20 centuries down the track, it's still applicable. Like,
Hey everyone, this is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. I have Rowe of Sentinel Apologetics on the channel. We're going to be talking about the creation versus evolution debate, how we should interpret Genesis, as well as the best objections to concordism. Rob, can you give us a brief background of yourself, as well as what you do on your channel?
thanks, Zach. So yeah, I'm in Australia, Perth, and I'm in the engineering department, and currently hoping to pursue, uh, career-wise, something in astrophysics, and that's line of, you
Hmm.
know, that career path. And um, as far as the YouTube channel that I run, and the blog, and even the studies are right. It's nothing but a hobby that started from 2017. 2 years prior, in 2015, that's when I became a Christian. My journey started in 2010, and let's just say the first 5 years, so like 2010 to 2015, which was nothing but like an academic approach on verifying the faith and looking into the Bible. That has then translated, because I suppose I have photographic memory, and I can sort of like, bookmark certain things, and I know what to look for. So yeah, I've sort of translated that, and and put that in writing, so to speak, with the stuff I've written, and also the whenever I run Q&As and or interviews as well on my channel. Um, and here's the thing, it's not like I've learned everything in 2015 and then I became a Christian. It's like it let's just say I knew the bare minimum that's sort of like required for faith, and then the next 7 years since then, so even right up until like a week ago, I'm still learning new things, and yeah, it's always to the glory of God, and praise God for the fact of the cross and the fact of the resurrection. That every time I put pen to paper, whenever I get back to, like, when I have the time to write on, say, Mark, I'm always, humbled at the fact of reality, the fact of the truthfulness of the Evangelion, the gospel, and yeah, that's basically who I am and what I do.
And could you talk about like what you're doing with your videos on your channel, as far as what topics you're going through right now?
Yeah, well, as of late, I've been I've been doing something I didn't expect to do. I recently got, uh, I suppose you could say, acquainted with a cult called Voice of Healing. It's run by a guy, Michael Petro. He claims to be an apostle, other titles like King of Kings, Mediator, all that stuff. It's nothing but a Gnostic cult. You have to learn the mysteries in order to attain salvation. Mentally, you have to like go behind the veil, into the holy of holies, so to speak. And I won't divulge into the grotesque nature of the teachings, but all I can say is, um, this past week I've been interviewing some scholars, and sort of like, because I made a promise to ex-members as well as members that it's not just me having a problem with these teachings. It's, in other words, I'll bring to attention scholars in relevant fields to sort of like react, even just to the preface of his book or even the introduction. And if they react negatively, and it's and the other one's doing it, hey, look, you know what I'm saying is in that sense vindicated. And so far, all five scholars the comments they've made, oh yeah, I can't wait for you to see the reactions they've had. And yeah, so in other words, that interview will be coming up maybe in about 2 weeks' time, maybe even less, maybe in a week's time. Um, and go and check that interview out because once I've done that, I can then continue to do what I usually do, which is uh, Second Temple stuff, ancient Near Eastern stuff, the sort of the topic of today, like Concordus scientific engagements, um, and just just general normal mainstream Christian stuff. Not the last couple of months has been a wild roller coaster with this cult, and yeah, I need a break basically. So yeah,
Nice. Yeah. So on that topic, as far as the whole Genesis debate goes, could you give everyone and everyone watching just a brief overview as far as your views on Genesis? Uh, you got a little mix of like the ancient Near East, John Walton, all that different kind of stuff, but also some stuff that maybe most of us haven't heard before, which is the concordist interpretation. So, of course, tell us what concordism is
yeah,
and your views on that.
yeah. Basically, I when I got into the faith, I I had something very similar to Hugh Ross, uh, say around 2013, 2014. Because here's the thing, a lot of Christians tend to not be educated in the scientific arena. There are Christians in science, but as far as like having a special kind of like between like you and me, like when we look at you and I were discussing Mark, right? So all the that niche areas which you'll find specialized in say biblical scholarship, but the biblical scholars that do that stuff don't really have any like the equivalent in niche areas in the scientific arena, but someone like Hugh Ross does. But the interesting thing is Hugh Ross doesn't have that in the biblical sense. You see, this is so I'm this young guy, right? Like yourself, that has I guess, the time and the youth, to sort of have both Hugh Ross and someone like John Walton on the same table, and I'm comparing the two. Now, I'm not saying Hugh Ross doesn't do that, and I'm not saying John Walton doesn't do that. They have corresponded, and they do, butt heads. But my approach was John Walton. You have no training with respect to the sciences. That's why you're butting heads with Hugh Ross. But then Hugh Ross, you have no training with, the ancient Near East. That's why you're butting heads with John Walton. And here's me watching this tennis match saying, you both are both sides of the same coin. And I had like a certain like epiphany. So in other words, coming into the faith, I'm reading Genesis 1, just like Hugh Ross. I'm thinking, wow, early conditions of the planet, water world, you have a chronology down, and then finally man's last. I hold to evolution, and even in a 4.5 billion year Earth history and humanity being about 200,000 years old, it's like chronologically it matches. But then um, my entire like interpretive worldview just comes crashing down when I started to then engage with someone like Mike Heiser and John Walton. This was in 2015 when I became a Christian. So I was of the concordist camp per se, with practically zero knowledge of the ancient Near East and the Second Temple stuff. Uh, Between 2010 and 2015. So up until 2014 was like more or less the Hugh Ross type of Christian apologetics with some basically surface level understandings of Old Testament, New Testament. In other words, historical Jesus studies like like James Dunn, Richard Bauckham, Gary Habermas, like as far as that goes, the resurrection, the fact of the resurrection. But then when I came across Mike Heiser and Walton and all that, since 2015, that pendulum from a hard concordism swung fully to the basically a non-concordist approach uh, for the next couple of years. Because I'm just like, hang on, in other words, that academic humility naturally kicked in because I've been trained that you're meant to have that, right? Because I'm realizing, wow, Hugh is just seeing it. He already has which is correct. It's a correct scientific worldview, but he's not being sensitive to the original context of the author. Like, duh, like you know. So someone like Walton and Heiser and so on will say, look, it's temple cosmology. And when I interviewed, say, Ben Stanhope, Stanhope very clearly pointed out um, Scott Noeagle's paper on, say, the very first verse of Genesis 1, like, God created heaven and earth, Eretz can mean Sheol, so, or the underworld. But then that fits the three-tiered cosmology of the ancient Near East because you have the underworld, which is the lowest point, and heaven, which is the highest point, and just like in the ancient Near East, how it starts off with this watery void, which is exactly what verse 2 says. The Spirit was hovering over the surface of the deep, this deep void. But then within the void comes this like bubble, where there's a separation of waters below and waters above. There's this like bubble that appears, and then the landmass that appears within the bubble, and then this becomes this a temple cosmos for Yahweh, where then in the middle of this void is the human temple that is shaped like the larger temple. You see, it's like oh my gosh, now the text, you start to realize, hang on a second, that's the original context, and it's quite remarkable. It's quite beautiful. It's quite like, you know, if you wanted to psychologize it from like human evolutionary perspective on how people used to think at the time, it makes a lot of sense because naturally so. The sky is blue. Why is it blue? Oh, but see, the ocean water is blue. Is it possible that there's a ocean up there, and how is it sustained? And oh, there must be this transparent canopy that sustains the waters. And Noah's flood specifically says windows of the heavens open so that blue water can come down, and so it's very consistent in all that ancient cosmology. But then I suppose when the pendulum shifted that way, let's just say, just like how in a real world physics experiment, a pendulum has to come back down. It can't just be stuck there. And sure enough, the pendulum came down, and let's just say it's been wobbling like this, back and forth between the two views, and it's still wobbling, because when I started to dig in a little bit more with, say, Heiser's work, uh, and now more so with Second Temple scholarship, and then the patristic writings, and I'm starting to notice that, hey, the so-called concordance approach that Hugh is utilizing is not new to him. In other words, you have the original context, the original author and the original context, and then over time you have what the Second Temple Jews would call a pesha, an interpretation that, like, like because of the context of their day and maybe a more advanced understanding of whatever it is, whether it's scientific, theological, philosophical, they then sort of like reread the text um, with that pesha, and there's a Latin phrase for this. It's called a sensus plenoa. It's this a full of meaning. Um, you see this in the New Testament. This is what caused the pendulum to drop down again. For example, Matthew 2. Matthew quotes Hosea 11 about Jesus coming out of Egypt. But Hosea is not a prophecy. Hosea 11 is not a prophecy of Jesus coming out of Egypt. Hosea 11 is talking about the Exodus. At some point back in time, Israel, my son, came out of Egypt. And Hosea is not even saying anything remotely like in the future there's going to be this. He's talking about a past event, and you'll see critics saying, "Oh, see, the New Testament misquotes the Old Testament." They don't know the context of this thing known as Pesher in Second Temple literature. So, for example, Christian apologetics books will say like Matthew was typologically seeing a sort of certain like there's a parallelism, just like Israel come out of Egypt, so Jesus comes out of Egypt and so on. But the point is putting aside the apologetic engagement of those passages. The point is what the patristics and so on will argue. The sensus planoa is full of meaning. Notice that. Hang on, if this can happen prophetically about, say, the coming of Jesus. So, for example, again, I'll give you two examples. Psalm 22 is not about Jesus. It's about David and his afflictions. Isaiah 53 is not about Jesus. It's about Zerubbabel. That's one particular view, which I hold. Some interpreters will say it's about Israel in Isaiah 53. The point is, you have the original context. Now, going along that same trajectory with the prophecies, let's just say, Second Temple Jews, including the New Testament authors, or like, say, the 12 disciples, right? Before Jesus even comes on the scene, right? Let's just say they're reading the Old Testament exactly the way you and I read it today. Isaiah 53 is about a dying and rising Messiah. Hosea 11 is about a Jesus figure. Psalm 22 is about, again, a Messiah that's dying on a cross, Um, if it was that transparent back then, before Jesus comes on the scene, right? Who is the one particular individual uh, that need not or should not know these details? Because if he did, he wouldn't have killed Jesus. It's Satan. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 7 and 8 clearly says, all the stuff to do with the cross, I'm not speaking human wisdom here. I'm speaking the wisdom that comes from God. And it's a wisdom, and it's a mysterion. It literally, it's some translations will say secret, others will say mystery, but literally the Greek mysterion means it's kind of like this paradox. It's hazy, and Paul says this. We look through a glass darkly, like it's hazy. Uh, it's a mysterion in the sense that this plan, which is the cross, right, to bring about our salvation, was like a paradox, a haziness, because if the archons of this aeon, the rulers of this world, the cosmic forces, Satan and so on, if they knew that plan, they would, and he clearly says in verse 8, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So, and again, the reason why, say the angels don't know the plan, because like in Job 15 and in other places, even the angels are known as the holy ones. They're considered to be, they're untrustworthy. They are also prone. There's a potential for them to fall and so on. So like 1 Peter 1 verse 10, or actually verse 12 says, even the angels look into these things. They don't really know the plan. When Jesus is talking, he's speaking in parables. Even the disciples are asking, why do you speak in parables? When Jesus comes down Mount Hermon in Mark 9, suddenly Jesus sort of like tests them. It's like, oh, by the way, the Son of Man will be handed over and he'll be killed, but don't worry, there's going to be a resurrection. And in the text, you have the disciples going, what the heck does he mean by the Son of Man will rise? Because again, in Second Temple literature, yes, they had a Son of Man figure, which is Daniel 7, right? But they had no concept of a Son of Man figure rising in history. They had the concept of a resurrection at the end of history, but not in history. And so the text clearly says, like, they started debating amongst each other, what does he mean by rising now? By the time you reach the end, when Jesus appears to them, they're still skeptical. And then finally, Luke, for example, Luke 24 clearly says he had to open their minds so that they understood the scriptures. And it's like, again, that sensus planoa moment, right? So it's like, in other words, to come back to that word mysterion, it's like it's a fact, it's a truth that's hidden in plain sight. It's not some secret Gnostic mysticism and secret like interpretation, like I know something you don't. It's the way God engineered it. It's like it's a fact that is just right there in front of your face, but you know, Satan himself didn't know the plan. When Jesus comes on the scene, even the demons are like, what, why are you here? What are you doing? Is this the time? Like even they're shocked. They don't know what to do. So to then when I had that realization about, you know, where you have say the original context of the authors, and then you still have and then between say Jewish theologians and Christian theologians, and there's this always this tension like, oh, the New Testament is this misinterpretation of the Old Testament because see, and the fact is they're telling the truth. It's they're not telling the truth as far as interpretation goes. What they're saying is it's true that you have to first appeal to the original context. So I agree with them on that. But then what's ironic is that someone like Hugh Ross is vindicated because when John Walton and Mike Heiser say that it was deliberately cryptic and then became unveiled at the right time with respect to the prophecies and so on, and hence those Jewish scholars who ridiculed the New Testament, now they have no arguments, they have nothing to stand on because when it's shown to them that look, in the fullness of time, right, salvation history and so on, that Second Temple Jews and now finally first century Jewish understanding that, the New Testament authors, when they finally like, and if Jesus was who he claimed to be, and then you see this fuller meaning take place with respect to who he is from the Old Testament, why can't I do the same, or Hugh Ross do the same with respect to the scientific endeavor? And all the more then, doesn't that verify that God indeed and the Bible indeed is something of quite a remarkable piece of text where it's able to, in other words, God is not intimidated by the primitive ancient Near Eastern cosmology, the wrongness of it. So he works with it. It's like, okay, yeah, you believe this stuff, I'll work with that. And then he utilizes temple theology to work with that, right? And then the same text also appeals to a modern scientific sort of like approach. Like in other words, when verse 2 says, and the earth was formless and or unformed and desolate and it was watery, it's like, yeah, the earth was, we call it the Hadean epoch. And yeah, then it did become a water world. And yes, it was dark on the surface of this water world because there's a thick cloud layer that blankets the planet. And yeah, when you have cyanobacteria appear, yeah, there's a terraforming of the atmosphere so that from an opaqueness it becomes translucent and then light comes in and then, like just day one in itself, any cosmologist would be like, yeah, that's exactly what we see. But then people like John Walton and Dennis Lamoury, like the pushback from them is, oh, but when we teach students in Old Testament class, we have all of them uh, before they introduce anything about concordism and so on to these students, they actually ask the class, can you like draw just a picture, maybe for like a 5-year-old, explaining to them what you see in Genesis 1 verse 2. And all of them draw a spherical Earth. It's watery. Or why is it dark? Maybe there's something that's blocking the sunlight. And but they're proving my point. It's like in the course of time, that is a fact of reality. When you look back in natural history and we verify what the early conditions was, right? Um, but then Walton and all these guys would say, but then you're just putting that on the text because when you and then what they do is they once everyone's drawn those pictures, then Walton will say, oh, guess what, guys? Here's the ancient Near Eastern cosmology. See, it's that canopy, it's that bubble that appears in a void, and all that stuff that I said a moment ago. And then the class is like, oh wow. But I'm like, but hang on, then since you're all Christian, like Walton and so on, then do the same with the prophecies of Jesus. Don't argue that Isaiah 53 is about Jesus. Don't argue that Psalm 22 is about Jesus. Don't argue that Hosea 11 is about Jesus. Yes, New Testament authors make the argument that it's about Jesus, but guess what? They're wrong. In other words, be consistent with your hermeneutic. If you're, I'm thoroughly for them to encourage what was its original context, which is, again is that ancient Near Eastern cosmology. But we do the same thing even with the other Old Testament texts that now then is then used to speak about Jesus. But what was its original context? So if there's like a dual nature to the text, it just communicates to me more so. You'll have a more powerful apologetic to the omniscience of God and the fact that God has a plan for this text to be applicable to all cultures at all times. To me, that communicates, like to use an engineering sort of example, he's like engineered the text to be sufficient enough to, there's always something new to learn. Uh, that's what makes the text, that's what makes the Bible so really unique and beautiful. And um, I can let me just give you one more concordance example, and then feel free to like jump in and ask questions. But
Sure.
one of my favorite ones, just to show you the course of this, right, is verse 20 of Genesis 1. So it's day 5, and notice the setup. So day 1 is the early conditions of the planet. Days 2 and 3 is about, the waters above and the waters below, and someone like Hugh Ross would say, yeah, it's that water cycle. Uh, Day 3 is land mass appearing. Day 4 is then from the translucency to a transparency. So, in other words, now clarity of the night sky. How interesting. You need vegetation in day 3, which up until 2009 was indeed a problem. And Hugh actually agreed. Yeah, this is a potential problem because vegetation should be coming in day 5 from, when we look at natural history, right? And then in 2009, a groundbreaking publication, like research, was released showing no, no, no. There's evidence now of plants and vegetation going back at least 1.9 billion years. Um, a billion years earlier than we expected, which means it's well before the Cambrian explosion, and the Cambrian is say day 5. So so that basically ever since 2009, Hugh's been hammering that away. It's like, look at that. So then, so then so day 4 then sets up that, right? It sets up day 5 because you need the visibility and so on, and in fact, you need a rapid jump in oxygen levels for then something like the Cambrian to take place. And sure enough, day 5, it says, and let the waters teem with the living creatures and so on. That sounds exactly like the Cambrian, about between 500 and 600 million years ago. But what's really curious is that the verse says, "Let the waters teem with these nephesh, these soulless creatures, and also generate birds." Now, ancient Near Eastern scholars like Walton will say, but then you see there's a parallelism. So in other words, the framework hypothesis, like like day 1 and day 4 complement each other. Day 2 and day 5 complement each other. Day 3 and day 6 complement each other. So in other words, days 1, 2, 3 are like the setting up for what will happen on day 4, 5, and 6. And so day 2 is waters above, waters below. So therefore day 5, let the waters teem. And sure enough, in the ancient Near East, see, waters where? Oh, both up there and down here. Because see, down here will be fish, but up there, because see, that's an ocean. Oh, what's up in the ocean up there? Birds. So in an ancient Near Eastern sense, let the waters teem. So waters up there teeming with the birds, and waters down here teeming with the fish. That's what Walton will do. But anyone who knows about evolution knows that birds come originally from fish, ultimately. And now, what's interesting is that before Jesus comes on the scene, you have Second Temple texts like, say, the Book of Enoch, saying, like in other words, you have Jews um, doing a pesher on these texts, and even the Talmud, which is about a century or two after Jesus, saying that the oceans generate feathered birds, specifically using the word for feathered. How interesting, right? And then the Talmud says, Rabbi so and so said this, Rabbi so and so said that. Oh, and by the way, isn't it interesting that bird feet look like they have scales like on a fish when they're commenting on Genesis 1:20? So they're, in other words, they're connecting birds and fish. In regards to the Talmud, here's on verse 20. So in Talmudic literature, you'll have like point number one, right? And then point number two, then point number three. So it's like the first thing is like, oh, look, cattle were created out of the dry ground, right? Then fish were created out of water, then fowls were created out of marshy ground. They may therefore be used for food by one side. Okay, it's like, okay, it's a bit ambiguous. And then a rabbi comes in and is like, well, actually, notice, observe, and proof of this last fact that fowls have scales on their legs similar to those of fish. Hmm. And then another engagement is like, well, yeah, because doesn't it say, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature and fowl? But at the same time, in chapter 2, it says, out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and fowl. So how can these passages be reconciled? And then again, it must be marshy ground, both water and yeah. But the point is, here you have even Talmudic scholars going, there's something interesting going on here, and how they make this connection that fowls and fish. Um, how about the Book of Enoch? Uh, so here's, I'll just type in feathered, because Charles Worth is the guy who did the translation. Okay, Thursday, with respect to the fifth day, right? I commanded the sea to engender fishes and feathered birds. All right? It just says it point blank. One of my favorite, though, absolute favorite, is Basil the Great. So, Basil says, let the waters, it is said, bring forth abundantly moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly. So why do the waters give birth also to birds? Because there is, so to say, this is like Darwin writing, a family link between the creatures that fly and those that swim. So then he tries to assume how they can be related in this like as if they are of the same family, right? So he's making now a scientific assumption, which is wrong, by the way. But notice he's still attempting one. So he's like, look, in the same way that fish cut the waters, using their fins to carry them forward and their tails to direct their movements and so on, right? So we see birds float in the air by the help of their wings. Okay, so that's his attempted scientific answer. It's wrong, but kudos for trying, right? But then the next bit, his conclusion, is still scientifically accurate. Both endowed with the property of swimming, right? Their common derivation, literally common descent from the waters, has made them of one family. Now, footnote 3, here is, now remember when Hughes said in the 1600s, scholars were engaging the stuff in the 1600s? The translator, which is this guy. So when you look at the date of this translation, this is done by Philip Schaff, 1895. All right. So Philip Schaff quotes from this French scholar. If you can read French, that's the scholar speaking about verse 20 in the same way as Basil said it. Guess when this guy lived in the 1600s. So even in the 1600s, they're thinking in these evolutionary terms. And then Philip Schaff goes, oh, and by the way, because he's living post-Darwin, right? The theory of evolution is, as is well known, that birds developed out of reptiles and reptiles from fish. Check Haeckel's monophyletic pedigree in his history of creation. Haeckel was a massive Darwinian defender and also an anthropologist and all that, paleontologist. And by the way, let me also just quickly say this. In that same passage, just before he reaches verse 20, he, here's a time in Christian history where Christians, and in this case the patristics, they start to remove themselves from the ancient Near Eastern cosmology. So in other words, Basil says it's foolish to think of the sky as a solar dome. So, and that's fine. Like it's interesting to see the more advancement of a type of like cosmological view, right? Leading up until Copernicus in the 14 1500s. But coming back to the 300s, Basil says, why do the waters give birth also to birds? And then he goes into this notion of, well, it air, and believe it or not, they had a sophistication of air similar to modern physics. Well, classical mechanics, that air is like a fluid, and hence if you take a course known as fluid mechanics, sure enough, for example, why do planes fly? Because again, if you treat air like a fluid, lift and drag, it works the same way, and water is just a more denser fluid. So Basil's like, well, it seems like the birds swim just like the fish swim. Because see, birds have like fins that, they flap, and so then, fish maybe, flapping in the water, so to speak, right? But then he says something very interesting. He's like, well, in that case, they must be of one family. They must derive from each other. He literally says common derivation of, the birds and the fish. That is in a Darwinian sense, that's common descent. And one family is like a monophyletic, what's known as a monophyletic pedigree. So notice you have Enoch, Talmud, Basil, and then if you fast forward to the 1800s, you have scholars that are translating and commentating on the early church writings, also realizing, whoa, this sounds very similar to, say, present-day Darwinism. Now, my final point on this is, what about in the middle? Someone like Calvin and Luther. So on the fifth day, the birds and fishes are created, and he's like, uh, it seems, however, but little concerned with reason. In other words, it's illogical that he declares birds to have proceeded from the waters, and therefore this is seized upon by captious men as an occasion of calamity. But although there should appear no other reason but that it so pleased God, would it not be becoming in us to acquiesce in his judgment? Stop judging what God decided to do, is what he's saying. And so why should it not be lawful for him who created the world out of nothing to bring forth the birds out of water? And what a great absurdity, I pray, has the origin of birds from the water than that of light from darkness. So therefore let those who so arrogantly assail their Creator look for the judge who shall reduce them to nothing. Okay? So Calvin's like, be patient. There's something, okay. Wait. This is gonna make you trip. It's trippy. This is the other quote I was thinking of. My bad. Now this is before Basil. Basil is in the 300s AD. This is the guy in the 100s AD, in the 2nd century, Hippolytus. He says this. He's a Christian quoting from Anaximander. Okay, Anaximander was a pre-Jesus Greek philosopher, like the 2nd or 3rd century BC period. Look at this. And that man was originally similar to a different animal, that is a fish. This is by Hippolytus, the first great Christian father whose history is Roman, is nevertheless not a Roman but a Greek. But anyway, but the point is, he lived in the 170s to 236 AD period, and he's quoting from in light of the fact that Anaximander, which is that philosopher, and so people at the time pre-Jesus, but at the same time, um, had run-ins with Hellenistic Jewish culture, right? So in other words, he would have been familiar with Genesis 1, making up all these theories. And here's a recounting of that one particular theory, that we originally were from the oceans. Um, so notice you have in writing, in Christian writing, um, a lot of it is wrong science, because again, we're dealing with science at the time. But you just come across little statements like this, which just, it's like, dude, you're right on the money. So,
What did Origin say? Did you talk about him yet?
oh, Oregon actually explicitly agrees. But then because Oregon is a allegorical thinker, so he's like, you know, Oregon would say something like, actually, wait, let me just get you this. Okay, I'll just zoom in because then you can be able to read it. But this is Oregon. Let the waters bring forth creeping creatures having life and birds. So then notice he goes, according to the letter, creeping creatures and birds are brought forth by the waters at the command of God. And we, notice this language, recognize by whom these things which we see have been made. So he's like, yeah, I agree. Somehow the birds have some sort of relationship, ultimately from the waters. But then comes Oregon's allegorizing. It's like, yep, okay, that's already a given. But let us see how also these same things come to be in our firmament of heaven, that is, in the firmness of our mind or heart. Notice how he now starts to allegorize firmament of heaven because firm means firmness of heaven. So he's thinking of heaven as the mind or heart, and the firmness, and then he goes into allegorizing big time. But the point is, he doesn't deny the natural fact in this paragraph over here. Um, so that's Oregon. And so yeah, this is just to give you like a taste, like just looking at Genesis 1, I am completely 100% for Walton, Ancient Near East, that lens, right? And then at the same time, uh, using the analogy of, say, prophecies in the Old Testament that are then concorded to apply to Jesus. There's this sensus plano, there's this a much deeper, fuller meaning that comes out. You can do the same thing using a modern scientific method. Um, and that's someone like Hugh Ross, what he does. Um, and I was going to say something else, but it slipped my mind. I think, yeah, it'll come back maybe later, but um, yeah,
We can go back to it.
that,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So I just wanted to make something. So I want to make this argument for my viewers the very best that it could possibly could be. So for that reason, I'm going to repeat what Rob said, which is that not only is, once evolution comes along, it seems to confirm this, like almost like it's has some type of predictability aspect to it, but also you have multiple authors before Charles Darwin that come along before evolution that seem to hint at some type of evolutionary aspect going on here. And yeah, I mean, obviously that's going to be super fascinating to some people. But so it sounds like that you so a lot of people take the Concordus approach, the Hugh Ross approach, because they They listen to Answers in Genesis, and they're like, well, Answers in Genesis or Young Earth Creation doesn't match up with what we hear in science. So then they move on to something like Hugh Ross, and they go, well, hey, he matches up with science, and we don't want the Bible to be wrong. But it doesn't really seem like this is your approach. It seems like you're saying, hey, I want to take the text as the ancient Israelite would take it, as the ancient reader would take it, but it also seems like that all these extra things add up, and that um, maybe through God's divine revelation that he's adding this other aspect to the text. Is that a
Hmm.
good summation of what you're saying?
That's perfectly said, yeah. And it's come back to me, that thing I was going to say, and that
Okay.
is, if you've seen Back to the Future, if you took the DeLorean and went back to say Moses' time or something, um, this is another epiphany moment I had when the pendulum swung in the middle, where I was realizing, wow, yeah, like how would you explain um, what we now know today, Big Bang and the conditions of the early Earth and say the moon collision event, all that stuff. Um, how would you explain all of that to them? I mean, so in the thought experiment, I was initially going, well, you'll have to teach them English, or you'll have to teach them German, or whatever, and you have to teach them math, and not base 60 math, base 10 math, calculate. There's just so many things you have to just, which is just totally counter to that culture, right? So then, but I still pressed on with that thought experiment. I was like, no, no, no. How about let's make it more interesting. How about we introduce these concepts, but we learn their language and their nuances and their ways of talking and their perspectives. In other words, we don't alienate them from these weird concepts that I have in the modern sense, right? In other words, it's exactly the sort of thing with the incarnation. You have the Logos emptying himself to accommodate the limitations of the human body and the you know the physics of this reality. So why can't I do the same by going back in time and accommodating 21st century physics? In other words, imagine the exercise, the fun exercise, or the challenge to speak Akkadian or Ugaritic or whatever, right? Say Einstein's field equations. Like, imagine going E equals mc squared in Akkadian. What would that look like? Um, so, um, you know, um, if is Genesis 1, it's sort of like it creeps me out if you think of it that way, because think about it, like if I went back in time and I wanted to say that the world was a water world, but that culture tells me we believe in a water world, but it's the chaos monsters, it's Tiamat and Marduk and the warring of the gods and so on. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, I get that. So in other words, Tiamat. So in Genesis 1 verse 2, it says Tehom. Tehom is the deep. Tehom linguistically is the equivalent of saying Tiamat. But the author of Genesis is not regurgitating the legends of the gods fighting. He's taking what Tiamat represents and demythologizing it and making it believe it or not, and quite interestingly, a very natural thing. It's just the deep versus what the ancients thought is some deity. So that's what I would do. I would not. In other words, I'm an atheist. I'm you guys are the superstitious ones. I'm still speaking your language, but they're not gods and deities. It's just the natural world. So in other words, the Genesis author is being like kind of like an atheist, or a high critical, like very like a full blown naturalist. Um, I'll give you another example in Genesis 1 about that. Um, Day 4 mentions the great light and lesser light. Isn't it interesting that if you're a native speaker, when it says great light and lesser light, anyone in the ancient Near East would find it odd. In fact, not only odd, but just bad grammar. For example, if you're looking at a sunset, and I said, wow, that great light's looking beautiful this evening, anyone will look at you kind of like weird, like, what? Like, it's the sun. The sun looks nice or beautiful while it's setting. Or, oh, the moon, like, in other words, culturally, we would say, oh, the moon's nice and bright tonight. But imagine if I went, that lesser light is looking nice tonight. Again, it's just weird. No one talks like that. But there it is in the Genesis text. So, in other words, Shemesh, which is the sun deity, if the author mentioned Shemesh in the text, then you see the author wants to remove himself completely from any superstition, any like deity worship or whatever. He just wants to completely naturalize everything and only give credit to God, right? So he even goes out of his way to deliberately not even say Shemesh. He just says great light. And the same thing with the moon deity. He just says lesser light. Um, so notice then the psychology here. If I went back in time in the DeLorean and I wanted to then introduce to this culture about the sun, they'll turn to me and like, yeah, Shemesh, it's this deity. Now, how would I make them unlearn that and make them think more naturally that it's just a natural object in the sky? Would I do it the way Genesis does it anyway? And the answer is, I can't think of any other way than what you see in the Genesis text. In other words, yeah, I'm speaking that language, but at the same time, I'm being a like a Richard Dawkins saying, no, it's just a great light, that's out there. Now, notice I don't have to go into even more specifics. I don't have to like speak about, say, the absorption spectra, and we know what the sun is composed of, and blah blah blah. All of that, all of those finer details can wait. Notice I'm still scientifically accurate by just saying it's just a great light, and the moon is just a lesser light. And I'm not in any way wrong in suggesting then the chronology of which one comes first and so on, and say the early conditions, moving through. So when you look at Genesis 1, it's like, it's this, if you think about it, it's kind of like someone going back in time and, with the hindsight of modern science and not modern understanding of the world, and giving one heck of a tweaked polemical thing that not only engages the ancient Near East, but is also affirming what you and I would now go, yeah, that is true. That is what natural history tells us. So then, coming out of this analogy, when you reflect back on the text and you see it that way, how else do you explain the phenomenon of the text? Is the text one heck of a lucky happenstance that someone just, I don't know, someone had one heck of a like a foresight when they looked around and thought of reality that way? Or is there some form of inspiration from a being who is not only the creator, but obviously he knows what he's doing, and he knows how everything works, and you see that's only the two options. And and that's just chapter one, by the way. When you get into chapter two, now you're talking about the Persian Gulf stuff, the localization of where Eden is, localization of human beings in the Persian Gulf. As you keep progressing through Noah's flood, it's that Persian Gulf, flooding, and like then you start to notice the so-called proto-history of Genesis 1 to 11 is history. It did happen. In other words, it's a faithful recounting of what actually happened to a people group, and um, yeah. So that analogy about like going back in time sort of like sealed it for me, that notice I can have both at the same time. Walton's Ancient Near Eastern stuff and Hugh Ross's Concordance stuff, and there they are. Just like the prophecies, I can go back in time to when Isaiah was writing about Isaiah 53. Imagine if I just told him, hey man, this text is going to be used for Jesus. He'll just look at you and think, what are you talking about? Um, but again, First Peter 1, verse 10 to 12 says that the Spirit of Christ, very interesting language. He juxtaposes Holy Spirit and Spirit of Christ in those two verses there. The Spirit of Christ in them, in those prophets, predicted these things about Jesus. And now we have the hindsight to have this. And then he gives a throwaway line. And by the way, the angels look into these things. And and then sure enough, notice the dualness of that. It's like there's the original context of the prophecies, and then when Jesus comes on the scene, so Isaiah 7:14, the virgin shall conceive. Well, that's talking about Isaiah's wife. And then, through the course of history, Parthenos, virgin, the Alma, Mary, it has complete application with respect to Jesus. So that's, in conclusion, that's basically it. You know, um, Let the Bible be what it is, and at the same time, don't be afraid to see how God, that there is a genuine, uh, usage of the Bible by first understanding its original context, that then you can go, wow, okay, can it apply to me today? Yes, it can. Therefore, the gospel is true. And yes, indeed, the audacious claim, go into all the world. Well, if this message is going to go into all the world, then I'm pretty sure God, and in this case Jesus, would know that this text would go into all the world. And if there is a divine human authorship going on with the text through providence, um, then yeah, God would have to make sure that the text is always cutting edge. Jesus was the same yesterday, today, forever. That sort of concept. Um, that's really it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So obviously a
Mm.
lot of good things there. I told you before, like as far as a concordist approach, this is definitely the best I've heard personally. Um,
Have you seen Sailhammer, by the way? Have you seen his translation of Genesis 1?
I think I've read it, but I don't remember anything specifically. Why do you ask?
Because that's the icing on the cake.
Okay.
That. What I'll do is I'll quickly bring it up. Uh, it's called the interpretive translation. Okay. What I'll do is I'll share my screen. Because John Sailhammer, he passed away in 2017, but he
Hmm.
was, think of him as a well-respected Old Testament scholar. Like he knew the languages, he's written in lexicons. Even
Hmm.
Heiser uses Sailhammer a lot in his Naked Bible podcast. In fact, very recently, he quoted Sailhammer for some Old Testament issue. So in other words, Sailhammer would side more so with Heiser and Walton than Hugh. Okay, so I'm
Yep.
just first giving that context first. Now, that being said, I copied and pasted his commentary, his translation, because he did a Genesis commentary for Zondervan. It's called the Expositor's Bible Commentary, and I posted this in my blog on my Sentinel blog. So I'm like, look, here's a translation by Sailhammer, and I'm again clarifying he is not accommodating modern science to the text, but rather allowing the text to speak for itself, especially on how an ancient Israelite would pass the grammatical rules of the text. But for us in the 21st century, it doesn't like show me how this contradicts modern science. That's basically my challenge. Now let's read Sailhammer's translation. In other words, translations like the ESV, King James, and so on, they're word for word, and sure enough, we should do that. But just like how we have translations like, say, the Amplified Bible, where we go into more of the dynamic equivalence, the sort of like a paraphrasing of the text. Surely the Jews would have been doing some form of paraphrasing. Like they would read the word, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And surely they're not just reading it and that's all they do. Surely there's commentary going on, and then if Hebrew grammar and rules can sort of like can allow for an expansive sort of like commentary on what's going on, just like me writing on Mark's gospel, and just like how you read other scholars with commentaries. What is the most like expressive paraphrase possible that the grammar of the Hebrew and all that stuff that it can allow without going into woo land and into eisegesis, right? How far can we go? What's the fullest elaborative expression can we have of all the Hebrew terms that appear in Genesis 1? That's why Sailhammer called it an interpretive translation, according to how a Second Temple Jew would translate this. So here we go. Long ago, God created the world. He created the sun, the moon, and the stars, as well as all the creatures which inhabit the earth. He created all of them out of nothing, not in a single instant of time, but over a vast period of time. That is Sailhammer's like like uh, prediction of the extent of how to translate Genesis 1:1 without going beyond the rules of the Hebrew text. So notice, for us when we read verse 1, it's like in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But the word in the beginning, Bereshit, so when translation says in the beginning, but hang on a second, people like Walton now will say, there's no definite article there. It's not a definite in the beginning. It's the same utilization as the unuma elish, when in the past, like long ago, when God began to create. And sure enough, Sailhammer's like, yeah, this is how we should be seeing it. Long ago, God created the heavens and the earth is a merism to mean the world. It doesn't mean heavens and earth. It just means the totality of everything. Notice this is Hugh Ross's argument. And so then, what constitutes the totality of everything? What constitutes the world? Things like the sun, the moon, the stars, as well as all the creatures which inhabit the earth. Okay, so that's what constitutes the heavens and the earth, right? All of this. But then, did it all happen instantaneously? And so that's what bara means. So now, with respect to bara, he created bara, right? Well, if Bereshit is talking about something that happened a long time ago, and then we're talking about the world that encompasses everything, the totality of everything that we understand, and since bara means something that comes into being from nothing, that means you can't say all of this happened in a single instant of time. But so in other words, the Bereshit at the first start of the verse, the Hebrew words for heaven and earth in the latter part of the verse, and then that bara in the middle communicates this idea that all of this happened over a vast period of time. And then verse 2, so that now notice that's verse 1. Then verse 2 is like, okay, now that we have this perspective in mind, verse 2, God's world, however, was not complete. He had not yet created human beings, and the land where he intended to put them was not yet suitable for them. There's your tohu vabohu, it's unformed and desolate. And sure enough, that is true, because whether you're talking, say, the Cambrian explosion 600 million years ago, the atmosphere, the oxygen level was too low for human beings, for you and I to breathe. If you're talking 2 billion years ago, same thing. It's even worse. Definitely not 4 billion years ago. So, yeah, it wasn't suitable, regardless if it was like, if you're a young Earth creationist or an old Earth creationist. The point is, there was a point in time where it wasn't suitable. So what was its initial conditions? It was covered by a deep ocean, and then notice Sailhammer presumes that the Jewish exegete would say, well, what else was happening was that the sun could not penetrate the dense fog which covered the waters. Now, you might be wondering, okay, that's an implicit, that's like a Sailhammer, that's like a subjective, you're presuming that they're going to say the sun could not penetrate. But then Sailhammer when you get his commentary, there's a footnote next to that phrase where he goes, actually, there's an Old Testament book that clarifies it is the sun, and that's in Job 38, where God tells Job, recounting the same Genesis 1 story, that when where were you, Job, when I laid the foundation of the earth? Where were you when I did this and that? And then he goes, when I made clouds to be its thick swaddling blanket that covered this earth. Because see, just before he mentions that, he says the morning stars were singing. What does that imply? This stuff that you're seeing in my background, which involves things like the sun, the moon, and the stars. So notice in Job 38, before it gets down to the conditions of verse 2, because see, verse 1 in Genesis 1 already includes the sun, moon, and stars in that merism phrase. So the sun's already existing in verse 1. Same thing in Job chronologically, when God speaks about the morning stars, yeah, the sun's already existing. And then Job 38 verse 9 speaks about how the earth is then blanketed with this swaddling blanket of like that makes it dark on the surface. And sure enough, you have there's a reason now that you can say, yeah, this sun that was back here in verse 1 naturally could not penetrate this dense fog, and the dense fog comes from Job 38 verse 9, which covered the waters, but God's spirit, however, was already present over the waters covering the land, and then it continues on into preparing the land, and on and on it goes and on it goes. So this, for me, this is like the final nail in the coffin for me. Sailhamer's the work, the final work on this that he did outside his commentary is called Genesis Unbound, um, where he sort of finalized it, and it was published in 2011. Um, and a lot of endorsements. Walter Kaiser, Gleason Archer, all the 20th century scholars, Old Testament scholars, endorsed it. And um, yeah, and Sailhamer's was the scholar who then it's just a given now in Genesis commentaries because of Sailhamer that when you reach day 4, notice he says the sun is in verse 1, right? And young earth creationists say, oh, the sun is created on day 4. No, no, no. Sailhamer beautifully shows there's a very interesting grammatical point about the verb for create. It's not create like now it's happening for the first time. It's hopping back to this object that's in verse 1 in that merism phrase is now having its final function to be seen now, because think about it. If there's an opaque atmosphere, you can't see the sun. If it becomes translucent, that's just a cloudy day. Day 4 is about transparency, where you can actually see it visibly, and now it has its appearing. Otherwise, because see the light in day 1, right? The light, when it says "Let there be light," it's not saying light's created. It's just now light's coming through. But where is it coming from? We don't know, because think about it. Like, imagine if you had no knowledge of the sun. All you're seeing is just light, and as the text says, an alteration of day and night. So suddenly you see this light behind this cloud layer just moving, and then it's dark, and then here comes the light again. So notice that's already talking about the rotation of the Earth, as we understand it, and so on. By the time you reach day 4, which in Earth's history, which is just before the Cambrian, finally a clarity. Actually, you can actually check this out. Let me just quickly show you this. Huros, day 4, haze. I think there's a graphic Huros shows. Not over here. Let's see. I'm looking for an image. Yeah, I'm sort of like Google imaging a haze, but I've seen. I'll just share my screen here. But I've seen him on his in his talks
Okay.
where he'll say, look, when you have a reduction of oxygen. So here's specifically the graphic he has of atmospheric oxygen. Let me share that
Nope.
again. Sorry. this one here. Okay. So notice you have a jump at the 4 billion year mark.
Mm-hmm.
So this is 4 billion years into Earth's history. Bang, you have this jump, and then this is where we are. So this period here is sort of unknown in Earth's history, but day four is sort of in the second half of the middle of Earth's history, which is this period. So in other words, it's erratic. Sure enough, this would be the hazy period. And so then by the time you have when the text says now that there's going to be, you know, that the sun, moon, and stars are visible, that means there's some form of increase in oxygen level happening here because when you have a rise in oxygen, you have then a clearer atmosphere. And because see, as Hughes says, therefore the denser the atmospheric haze, the thicker will be the cloud cover. But then the moment you have an increase in oxygen, which can only happen because of the vegetation that's there in day three, um, this haziness will clear up, and um, and then because I mean there's other graphics like the frame of reference, the atmospheric layer, there's the ocean, and but yeah, I also just wanted to quickly point that out. Basically, Sailhammer, just to summarize that point, Sailhammer has written on the fact that the sun in day four is not being created for the first time. It's this, the emergence of this object because of the clarity of the atmosphere, and in other words, we can explain that scientifically. Um, yeah. So.
Yeah. Just for the audience sake, so obviously people don't know about Salhammer. That's actually what a big part of the dissertation of Seth Bastille, which is what I did the video on of Adam as Israel. So
Hmm.
you're going to see a little bit of similarities there. But of course, a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, that translation, he's just trying to put evolution in there." So do you know if he's evolutionist or um, do you know anything about that?
Uh, I think he was a little bit more older. That's a good question. I don't really know. But let me just say this. Sailhammer was absolutely not, um, he has no training in the sciences. And and I actually confided in Hugh about this. I was like, hey, Hugh, I came across this guy named Sailhammer, and obviously Hugh would know about him, right? And Hugh goes, you know what? I've actually interacted with him when he was alive. Uh, you see, that's another thing in academia. The more interactions you have with these scholars, the more you realize that at the end of the day, they're just human beings like you and I who, yes, they're doing very specialized work in their own respect, but they're actually in constant communication with each other. That's something that's something we don't seem to realize that these are people that outside their special niche research areas they correspond casually. And Hugh in his because he's old enough to have corresponded with Tailhammer anyway, right? So so he's told me, yeah. And in fact, uh, Hugh uh, tried to have Sailhammer endorse Hugh's concordism. In other words, because 2011 was around the time when Hugh and RTB is in any case they're well known, right? Um, and Sailhammer goes, "Sorry, Hugh, I respect your position, but that would that would be disingenuous to what I'm doing here because all I'm just a Hebrew linguist. I'm not a scientist. All I'm wanting to do here is enter into the discussion by showing this is how an ancient Israelite would have passed the text. Passed, not PASS, PARSE, like how they would have the grammatical rules and the extent of it and so on.
Right.
And and Hugh goes, well, that still works for me. And Selama goes, I know you'll use it, and I'm fine with that, but I can't endorse your work because that'll show some form of like, in other words, people who have an axe to grind, right? will
Yeah.
make up all these conspiracy theories, like I'm secretly trying to like you know uh you know finding I'm trying to find some sort of like technicality to try and defend Hugh's old Earth stuff, right? No, I don't care. All I'm saying is this is what the Hebrew grammar says, and if you're a young creationist, you have to deal with it. If you're an older creationist, well, it just so happens to be more of an ally for
Hmm.
an old Earth, right? Um, so yeah, so in other words, that translation by Sailhammer is like fantastic because remember a moment ago when I said if you went back in time and you tried to communicate to these people, it's like that is it. So in other words, a blend of Walton, blend of Hugh Ross, um, and then you realize, hang on, but then that's it's divine, it's God. God's the one that's like what the New Testament says. It's inspiration is like wind filling the sails. You know, the Holy Spirit guided the writers. It's this. It's not like the Matrix. You know, downloading information. It, inspiration doesn't work like that. It's not esoteric like that. It's an author writing, and he has the free will and the prerogative to write it. So in other words, the Bible is a human book. But that suddenly, just like how authors today will speak about an epiphany, but then that's what makes the Bible interesting. It's these had epiphanies that now become a timeless message. And how do you explain such epiphanies? Um, you know, in other words, do you take Second Timothy 3 seriously? That it was Theopneustos, it was God breathed. Um, and I believe Paul when he says that because when I see something like Genesis 1 where it's two sides of the same coin, it's like, yeah. Um, so,
Yeah, no, that's really good. A lot of powerful points there. Um, but obviously, you're gonna have objections. As
okay,
we're
yeah,
going
go
through
for it.
this video, as we're
Hmm.
going through this video, you got 17 different people going, nah, this right here. So let's get to
Hmm.
that.
Yep, go for it.
So all right, so common objections to concordism. So this is one. This view of concordism requires secret codes to exist in the Bible that no one knew about for thousands of years. It's like, okay, what's the purpose of like all this when no one would even have any understanding of this for thousands of years? What do you think about
Hmm.
that?
Yeah, that is that is you're reacting then to a form of concordism and also a miscommunicated form of concordism, uh, uh, and a misunderstood. And I would agree with you on that. I'm trying to not fall into that category. Uh, what I'm saying is how interesting if I were to read, say, the Enuma Elish or whatever. None of these ancient religions have any like lasting appeal to you and I today. We don't read about Marduk and Tiamat and all that. How interesting! It's the Genesis one narrative that still appeals today, and and I'm suggesting that um, um, in light of the education I've had, and yes, science is always refining itself, but again, it's just heavily misunderstood when that same person might go, okay, God may have put these hidden secret messages, which again is a misunderstanding of what I'm saying, but let's just go along with that. Notice then when I say it's not that, notice because if I said it is that, I'm then saying the secret message can only go so far because it's only limited to that's all it is. And so therefore, if science comes along and suddenly a discovery tweaks science and changes the scientific outcome, right? That totally defeats that so-called hidden secret mystery. Um, and then I would agree with you. Then, oh, there we go. Now the whole endeavor is destroyed. If it's not that, if it's exactly the way I explained it, where it's it's just an interpretive lens. It's okay. Here's my ancient Near Eastern lens. Okay, to whom? the deep, Tiamat. But then I'm speaking now in hindsight of modern science, modern science lens. Okay, watery deep, the planets, the water world. There's no contradiction. It's I'm still reading the same text. I'm not like trying to retranslate certain words and find, esoteric meanings. Um, and so uh, something has slipped my mind, but uh, repeat the question again. Like,
Yeah, so you have this idea of like, all right, so from the very beginning of like when these texts are created, you have, in your view, you have okay, what as the ancient reader would have read and understand it, but then you
mm,
also have this other lens of like how modern science is and how that works. So basically, the issue is, according to some people, is that you're basically that modern lens is almost like a secret code that no one would have known for thousands of years,
yeah,
and then we're finally coming upon this secret code, and it's just like, okay, what's the purpose of this long code?
right. And so what's come back to me is um, they'll also say on top of that criticism, science changes or like every day or some colloquial term like that, right? Like that phrase. That's again another misunderstanding of science. Science is not just it just changes. Science is the endeavor, for example, geocentrism is because of the fact of heliocentrism. Is geocentrism wrong? No, it's just your frame of reference. I could go right now into the middle of the Pacific and use the geocentric math to still navigate myself to safety if I wanted to. But if I went to the moon and I was circling the moon, like the Apollo missions, can I now use geocentrism? No. Because now my frame of reference is either moon centrism in that sense, or say if I'm trying to survive that trip because I need to get back to Earth, the Earth Moon system now becomes the centric focus, or the Sun, heliocentric. So notice that these models, these scientific models, are models that that so from geocentrism to heliocentrism, is heliocentrism when heliocentrism comes on the scene, do we just throw geocentrism out the window? Believe it or not, heliocentrism is an upgraded geocentrism. It's just math tweaked and the physics tweaked, and then it becomes this thing called heliocentrism. Same thing with Newtonian mechanics. Newton's apple falling down, all that stuff. Um, in the classical mechanical sense. So take something like F equals ma. Mass times acceleration, is the force. Um, or momentum. Momentum equals mass times velocity. Um, Now, in light of Einstein's relativity, so you have what's known as the Lorentz, factor. And because now you have to take into account speed with respect to the speed of light, and you can tweak it with time, so time dilation works with that. So in other words, on everyday like roads, we're still using classical mechanics. The moment you start talking about, atoms, you know, colliders, where you're smashing atoms, or even a spacecraft potentially going at say 50% the speed of light or something like that, right? Time dilation and relativistic effects do take place. Now, anyone here who knows physics or who knows equations in physics will immediately get it. So when Einstein starts formulating the math, which he's using Lorentz factors and the Lorentz transforms and all that, does he have to like reinvent Newton's equations like F equals ma? No. Guess what happens with F equals ma? F equals ma still stays in the equation. It's the denominator that changes. So F equals ma is ma divided by 1. Now the 1, you shove in the square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared. You shove in this Lorentz transform in the denominator with the ma on the top, and now that's a whole new upgraded version of Newton's initial equation. It's still the same equation, you're just shoving in this whole thing in the denominator. You see, it's the same thing with um, am am I as or was Einstein, I don't know, using esoteric knowledge or some like divine mysterious thing to realize, oh, see, in the ones, the denominator had 1, but no, it was actually this other thing known as the Lorentz transform that should have been there. It's like, whoa, we've never seen that before. And no, it's just, over the course of time and with more rigorous like interpretive issues, mathematically, it's like, and then investigations of reality, it's a tweaking and an upgrading and a it just keeps growing and growing and growing. In other words, it's growing towards the truth of the matter. You're getting ever so close to the truth. So therefore, science is all about not discarding the prior data points. You're needing the prior data points because look how far we've come. Because if it wasn't for those prior data points, we wouldn't have this much more advanced understanding. Is it possible with the Bible? How ironic! It's exactly that. When I use the prophecy analogy, you had the original, Newtonian classical mechanics, which is the original authors doing their own thing, and then hang on, that same F equals ma can be used in a more advanced way. So the same Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, Genesis 1 can also be used. Well, talking about prophecies, it's Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, Hosea 11. That can be used in a much more advanced way, and it's applicable to Jesus now. Can't I do that with Genesis 1? What Sale Hammer is doing with the Hebrew text. He's not like, you know, I have this mystical insight and I knew something you didn't, and I'm retranslating this word to mean this. No, he's not doing any of that. He's just saying, being very fair to the rules of Hebrew grammar and the culture at the time and so on. What would be their interpretation? That's his translation. And how interesting! I don't even need his translation. I can read the word for word translation, right? And I can still come to uh, with the hindsight of natural history now, um, the correspondence between the two. And but then at the same time, if I was debating purely on a theological ground with an ancient Near Eastern pagan, it would make no sense for me to go down a Hugh Ross trajectory. It would make more sense for me to go down a Walton Heiser trajectory, polemically showing Tiamat is not the true God. It's Yahweh or Shemesh, the sun deity that you're talking about. No, it's just a greater light. Um, so the text appeals to both. If I'm isolating the text to be just one of the two, well, in this case, more so the concordance approach, and I'm ignoring the Walton approach, now the accusation stands true, in my opinion. Then it's a valid like critique because it's like you're disrespecting the original context. Um, and I think this has application for Christians in their apologetic with respect to the prophecies. If you're debating Muslims or Jews and you're trying to win them over to Jesus, and you just say, oh, it's all over the Old Testament, Jesus, Isaiah 53 and so on, you're hitting deaf ears. They're not seeing that. You need to step into their shoes, show them that you understand the original context, and then show that, oh, look, how interesting. The parallelism takes place, and how interesting, Jesus does fit those passages. Um, because that's what the New Testament authors did. There's a concording with respect to the present circumstance, which is Jesus, with with what was already written. Um, so yeah.
Have you? I actually earlier as I was preparing for this,
Mm,
I watched a video on John Walton and like his different types, his what he thought about concordism and all that, and he basically said something like, "Okay, yeah, so the New Testament writers do this. They do some type of concording, but the reason why we can be confident and we can trust them is because we know that that text is inspired. We don't have any writings from the Old Testament of people from the New Testament writing up the Old Testament
hmm
saying that this like to confirm it. It's
hmm
basically just like we would never even be able to know.
hmm So in other words, and I've thought this myself as well, like, do we then become, you know, this because this goes into the whole, is the canon closed and does inspiration still continue today?
Hmm.
And I personally, I side with the cessationist, like a semi-cessationist view where the canon is closed, because if you think about it, if I said it's not closed and and infallible inspiration continues today, then anyone can make that, and then you fall into cults, right? Very easily. Um, so I do obviously sympathize and agree that, yeah, no, we need to understand the Holy Spirit and its divine dictation, and someone ends with revelation. But you then have church history to look at to see how, quite curiously, how this Holy Spirit and how Christians post the closed canon, how they still relied on the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to make certain decisions. And they had a couple of verses in the New Testament to be encouraged by this. So in Ephesians 3, verse 10, it says that, so like, I'll read from like verse 8. So he's like, "To me, the very least of all the saints, this grace was given so that I might proclaim to the Gentiles the immeasurable wealth of Jesus and help everyone see how this mysterion, this secret, right, which is about Jesus, right, that has been at work was hidden for ages by God who created all things." So very interesting. Paul's right off the bat talking about all that stuff that the Old Testament speaks about ultimately with respect to Jesus. You know, I'm the very least of all these saints, and grace is given to me that I might proclaim to the non-Jews, the Gentiles, this wealth in Jesus with respect to this mysterion plan of God about the cross and so on, which has now been, like, it's no longer a mysterion because it's as plain as day, because the cross has already happened, resurrection's already happened. There's nothing secret about it anymore. It's finished, right? So then verse 10 is the key verse. He did this so that now notice this, through the church, the wisdom of God in all its variety, and the Greek for all its variety, it's a beautiful word. It means like an object that every time you turn it, this a new shape or new structure or new color or new, it's something new. And then if you turn it again, something new. And even if you turn it back to what where you originally turned it, and you presume you might be seeing the same face that you see it, no, 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 it's still something new. In other words, it's practically near infinity, the newness of this object every time you turn it. So, and translations translate it as, um, the wisdom of God in all its variety, this multifaceted wisdom, every time it's something new, might be made known to, and then he uses the phrase, the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realm, and so on. So they would, now Paul's obviously talking here, theologically about specifically Jesus, but then the patristics will take that and say, but this can apply in anything, like, for example, when Basil starts to wonder about, the fish and the birds and all that. And that's why you have the church fathers' writings, because it's like suddenly they have free reign to write and express their ideas in this, and notice the church becomes this grand vehicle by which the wisdom of God in all sobriety can now be unveiled. To sort of like summarize that point, notice Nicaea is an apt example of this. Why? Because how ironic, if it wasn't for Arius and the Arian controversy, there would be no Nicene Creed. So in other words, we have to thank pagans and wrong, people who got things wrong for that wisdom of God that's now suddenly become much more expressive in the Nicene Creed than say the first century New Testament authors would have ever dreamed of doing. In other words, it's not saying that the Trinity is now established finally in Nicaea. No, the Trinity was already there in the first century, but a further elaboration of the truths of what the Trinity is, which what we call the Athanasian or Nicene Creed and so on, that sensus per noah, the further like elaboration of it. Notice the church now is the vehicle by which it keeps getting refining, kind of like again that Newtonian analogy, Newton to Einstein to you know. So what more? 20 centuries later, which is now the time we're living in, huge advancements, and how interesting. If you don't you don't have an agenda, like in other words, you don't force the text to read a certain way, but you still stick with the parameters of hermeneutics and exegesis, like how it should be done. Which again, guess what? The school of biblical scholarship and the Bible and language, ancient languages, like that's why we have that so that scientists like you, Ross, won't go too far afield, right, in their interpretations. But simultaneously, the biblical scholars, since they're not trained in the sciences, they rely on the scientists because it's at the end of the day, it's the data that they're gathering that tells now the biblical author, hey, this is the way the world works. And then it's that the book of nature and the book of scripture, that correspond to each other. Um, in conclusion, now that I mentioned book of nature, you have a Reformation creed, believe it or not, in the 1500s, the Belgic Confession, Article 2. By what means do we know God? First thing it starts with is by the universe, which is like a most elegant book. And then the second point is, oh, and by the way, also by his son Jesus through the scriptures. Um, so you already have, um, in Reformation Europe, that nature. Like I can just look at this mug, uh, as sort of like a Romans 1:20 moment. Like I can see the natural world and implicitly see the invisible attributes of God's divine nature. Um, yeah, and that led to the scientific revolution, by the way, because Reformation Europe is the reason why science, even as a method, even began. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, totally. So another objection is to say that the even today, as you know, you're basically coming up with or um, discovering essentially this new view of how this matches up with what we see in the world in regards to inspiration and natural world. Um,
hmm
but even then, it's not clear according to most people, and it's actually super confusing to most people. Like, do you see an issue with that?
yeah. But I think it's I hate it, and this may come across as some sort of like elitism. Uh, but it. Look, those who know, say, multivariable calculus and can do you know, high order, like really high level physics, and they will be like, yeah, Rob, I agree. This is the way things are in the natural world. Uh, but then those who are like the Waltons and the Heisers and so on, who don't have that scientific backing, uh, will be like, yeah, Rob, I agree that that's what the ancient Near Eastern context of the Bible is. And I'm saying okay, I'm not specially trained. I'm actually more so trained in the Huros or the science side of things, so I can definitely speak that language. But I believe that I've invested enough time in the ancient Near Eastern Walton side, right, and in this case the biblical stuff, to sort of just throw it out there. It's like, hey guys, you are more in agreement than you realize. And I've told this to Hugh as well, in because he runs a Sunday school paradox class, and I told him, look, the more I think about this, the more I realize there shouldn't be a division. And here's the thing: younger creationism is a concordist model, but which concordist model wins? Well, obviously it wins on the basis of the science. The science, disagrees with the young creationist model. Um, so, but the science agrees with Hugh Ross's model because Hugh Ross is relying on the science, right? But then Hugh Ross has a unique advantage that atheist scientists don't have, and that is he has knowledge of the Bible. And and Hugh Ross can't help but go, the text in like a poetic fashion and also in a very simple sort of fashion chronologically lays out the natural history of Earth. Walton will react to that going, no, you can't do that. It's temple cosmology and so on. But then Hugh Ross is like, well, just 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 indulge, like just humor me. This is what happens from this to this to this in the natural in natural history. Why does a text coincidentally read like that? Here's the thing. I actually told this to Heiser once in one of my first interviews with Heiser on my channel. I brought up the fish birth thing, and I kid you not, Heiser actually was taken aback by that. He's just like, actually, you know what? I quote him verbatim. He's like, well, maybe you could use that with an evolutionist. In other words, like to sort of like attract them into, say, reading the Bible. But then Heiser, and I sympathize with why he said this, but it's like he's like, but I still would shy away from that approach. But here's the thing: on his own podcast, he's admitted he's not trained in maths, he's not trained in the sciences, he's a language guy. Walton uses the same phrase, I'm a language guy. And that's my frustration, is that Hugh Ross is not a language guy, he's a science guy, and he doesn't know how to communicate to those in the languages. And the language guys are not scientists, and they don't know how to communicate their frustration to people like Hugh Ross. And I'm saying I'm this middle guy going to a certain a certain level of sophistication. I may not be a language expert, but I've been in this long enough to know the arguments generally now. I'm definitely, I can definitely be the science communicator, and I'm a Christian who takes the Bible seriously. So with all these so-called biases in place, it's like if you was here and Walton was here, I'd be like, dude, guys, come on. You are, you know, you have no idea how much of an. In other words, if I was to write like a book giving like my model, I'd be first crediting Walton and Hugh Ross simultaneously. And I know they'll be looking at me going, "What the heck? We oppose each other." I'm like, "No, you don't." In my model, no, you don't. Um, that I don't know how much more. I don't know how much more like simpler I can make it. Like that. Like that's literally my model. Is a marrying of the ancient Near East with a modern understanding, and should that not make you go, then how could a human author write it like that, or design the text to be not only applicable to its original audience, but 20 centuries down the track, it's still applicable. Like, yeah.
Yeah, totally. So, another objection. Um, No scientific discovery has been tied to determining the Bible gives future science. It's basically like, here's what it is, let's go find it. Here's what it is in the Bible, let's go find it in the natural world. Uh, like basically making this prediction. But it's almost like you said earlier that it actually does do this. Is this right?
Um, yes and no.
Okay.
Uh, when you do it wrong, where you force science in the natural world to fit your interpretation of Genesis 1, that's the young Earth creationist stuff. Uh, and and definitely the flat earthers as well.
Yeah.
I see flat Earth, and I agree with them. It's like that is the Walton Ancient view. It is a flat Earth, and then they force with the most just amazing manipulation of the data, scientific data, to then conclude that see the Earth is flat. No, the Hugh Ross method and most of my method is I'm not looking to validate the Bible, and I'm not looking to science to validate the Bible. So I'm not looking, yeah, either way. It's the two that why is it two books? Because scripture is scripture for that very reason, for whatever it is, right? God, the plan of salvation, all that, and it just so happens to have these other details. And science, that's all it's meant to be. It's just this the drive to understand the natural world, the world around us. And then now notice I can sort of zoom into one and focus on that for a while, and then zoom into another, focus on that in a while. But when I start to zoom out and I have them, all cards on the table, I'm like, wow, the Earth, there was a Hadean epoch, water world, tohu wabohu, unformed, desolate, water world. What's the heck's going on here? Uh, Now the question, what you're asking specifically is, can we make predictions? You see, now that you're starting to see a hint of that with verse 20. Starting to see like, you know, Basil and Calvin and finally then Philip Schaff, and then the Talmud and Enoch, like the Second Temple Jews, wondering. The text says birds come from the waters. Are birds and fish related? You see, and they just leave it at that. Uh, Especially Calvin. Finally, Philip Schaff comes on the scene. Oh yeah, evolutionists teach this. Um, so notice that no cosmological model is like you know uh, forced. It's open. It's always open. And even right now, um, both scientifically and even biblically, I'm still open because I wouldn't be surprised if something new happens. But again, it's in the context of the analogy I gave about Newton and Einstein. It's not that Einstein comes on the scene and contradicts Newton. It's an upgrade. So in other words, I wouldn't be surprised from a year from now if again I come across something new in the Genesis 1 account that further upgrades my knowledge of oh I like see I missed that word that means this, and now in hindsight of newer scholarship, bang, wow, that just adds now more on top of that. But then then I'm introducing the concordance approach. See, like let's see what happens with that. As far as another prediction goes, Hugh's written on this. It's not so much. It's the same thing can apply with the prophecies of Jesus. Again, if the prophecies of Jesus were so transparent, why didn't they just expect it? Like, by the way, we're expecting Jesus to arrive right now. Oh, there he is. Oh yeah, don't worry, Jesus. We expect you to die and rise again. Like, it's the same sort of thing here with if there's scientific accuracy, like how can you make a prediction, a so-called scientific prediction, um, with the basal knowledge you already have with respect to the text at hand, right? So, but Hugh has attempted this. In other words, he's taken on the challenge. One specific book I recommend is the book Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, where it's sort of like already in the present, but at the same time a prediction, where he's like, look, the whole global warming situation at the moment, Job 38 makes explicit, detailed, from God's own mouth, so to speak, admonitions on taking care about the water cycle and certain precipitation levels like snow, ice, and so on, and steam. And basically, Hugh's point is, okay, it's very simple. It's very simple wisdom statements. But I can tell you, as a scientist, it's kind of like it's kind of like a little child saying the obvious, where other people may not have realized, and suddenly it clicks, right? And or a little child that says something where it's very simple, but at the same time has grand sweeping ramifications when a more like sophisticated intellect hears what that little child's saying. It's the same thing with the Job text. It's like this cute little text, like, oh yeah, the precipitation level is if there's ice, like in other words, simultaneousness of ice, uh, you know, you know, you know, so water in an ice form and then liquid form and then gas form, and because a lot of planets in the solar system don't have all three forms simultaneously. Earth is very unique, where it has all the forms simultaneously. So, so then someone like Hugh Ross will go, I can explain that scientifically, and the fact that it's even mentioned in the text like that gives me a further like um, uh, admonition and a warning that since God is the one saying this is how it should be, what would happen if it what would happen if one of those forms disappears, right? In other words, there's no more ice, for example. Um, oh boy, that would be the end of life as we know it. So in that book, Hugh wants to tackle the global warming issue, and he's like, look, isn't it interesting? The text seems to want to emphasize on key parameters of creation, like precipitation, or like certain species, the 10 nephesh creatures in Job, from the end of 39 all the way into 40. So, for example, the goat, uh, or even the whale. How interesting! The whale actually, the more whales we have, it helps global warming. Believe it or not, it's the phytoplankton that feed on whale feces, and the byproduct of the phytoplankton, as they feed on the iron-rich feces of whales, the phytoplankton give off oxygen. So if you bring down the whale population, you know global warming increases. Um, Goat domestication, because goats are known for eating certain weeds and thickets and thorns, and in other words, they're able to minimize fires. Um, when God speaks about how God commands lightning strikes, you know, to be at his beck and call, so to speak. From like the International Space Station, we can see distribution of lightning strikes around the planet. It's just amazing to see. And then how interesting when we see the timing. It is random, but at the same time, lightning strikes are vital for uh, you know for plant growth and nutrients and all sorts of very fascinating things just with the sake of a lightning strike or a cyclone on one side of the planet. Yes, it's devastating and chaotic, but then there's a recycling that happens. It distributes the nutrients and so on, so that on the other side of the planet it can benefit from hurricanes and cyclones and all that. So yeah, in other words, Hugh can take just these simple like statements and go, how amazing how such a simple statement, now in hindsight of this most sophisticated science knowledge, it encourages me to go, if these phenomena in the natural world stop, it's the end of life as we know it. So as a scientist, how can I maintain that there's going to be continued lightning strikes, continued ice, water, and vapor, continue this and that, um, with respect to the ecosystem? You see that in that very interesting way, it's like what's already in the text is sort of like to cause, uh, to prevent, uh, uh, you know, the destruction of the planet, so to speak, right? So in other words, there's a very interesting indirect like prediction that if it wasn't for if these things cease to exist, the prediction is end of the world. But it's not the end of the world if you maintain this. Um, so I find that approach quite interesting. You won't find, you won't find information on like, quantum mechanics and like, you know, the weak force and the strong force and that's all. Notice that those things need not be in the Bible. Again, coming back to the analogy I used about if you went back in time to speak to an ancient Near Eastern person about the sun, do you really need to go into the intricate details of the nuclear, fission and fusion that takes place in the core of the sun and all that stuff? No, I don't need to speak about all that. There's a certain level at which I can talk about the sun as an actual fact that a 21st century scientist would agree with, but at the same time, remember that the thought experiment had a certain rule, not to alienate that older culture. Um, so in other words, I'm satisfying the the farthest extent I can go with respect to that older culture, and at the same time satisfying a 21st century scientist who might eavesdrop on that conversation. You see, how do you do that? I'm saying it's Genesis 1. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Nice. Yeah, that's a good explanation of that. All right. So we got. So this is a bit of a interesting one. Um, so what we noticed from the New Testament is that Jesus had a very different mission than we would have expected, or even the Israelites would have expected. Um, Specifically, like scientifically speaking, like he could have done a lot of things, um, and a big what some would say is a big knock on concordism is that Jesus could have revealed this special knowledge that maybe Genesis 1 is referring to, or Job, or all these other passages, that Jesus could have revealed things like germ theory or antibiotic development, which would have prevented millions of deaths from diseases. Like, if God's or Jesus is trying to save the world, like that seems like a very interesting way to do it, and that'd be very powerful, obviously. And then these same people would say, Jesus, God, he never requires us to be somewhere else in our development for him to reach down to us. He meets us where we are, even in our greatest failures and ignorance. He accommodates
Hmm.
us. So that's obviously different than concordism. um, if if the Bible did have this special knowledge that could heal people, like it's almost like we would expect to see it in Jesus, or maybe even somewhere near that time period, but we don't. We see kind of a little mix of the other objection, which is that thousands of years later, it's just like what's the point kind of thing.
Hmm.
It's not a direct contradiction to what you're saying, but it raises an interesting question. What do you think about
Hmm.
that?
Yeah. I think it's now in the hindsight of everything I've seen now in Mark so far, like in Mark 7, when when he's engaging with the Pharisees, and like in that Pharisaic that later became like a Talmudic, uh very like elaborative You have to do this, you have to wash your hand a certain way, this, and you have to do that and do that. All to do with like ceremonial cleanness and just before you eat. And how interesting, this believe it or not, there's this psychological phenomenon of what's known as disgust, and I put this in the Mark commentary, like the particular scholar that she focused on this phenomenon of disgust, and how Jesus, like, if he is indeed God in flesh, he should know, you know, um, the facts of germ theory and so on, and I believe he did. But yes, kind of like what you mentioned a moment ago with respect to this accommodation, right, with the known culture at the time. Jesus does this as well. So one example would be the mustard seed. When he says it's the smallest of all seeds, Jesus is not saying that. It's the culture that says it. But then the critic, uh, who might criticize Jesus, like, Jesus, you should know better. And I put this in the Mark study as well. Like, so you mean to tell me that Jesus, if he were to just tell them, hey, a mustard seed is, you know, or the smallest seed with respect to the mustard seed is like 1/10 of 1% of all seeds or something, right? Like, no, they would just be like, what are you talking about? You know. So in other words, he takes that phrase of the time, the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds, which is wrong scientifically, but then says another wrong scientific statement straight after that. That same mustard seed will become a cosmic tree. Okay. And what's interesting is, if we were in that culture, we would have nodded our heads, yes, yeah, we know the mustard seeds are smallest of all seeds. In other words, in within the vicinity of their own, with that culture itself, he's not saying something wrong. He's saying something correct. But then he veers into something wrong, even for them, that the mustard seed becomes this cosmic tree. And how interesting. Uh, what the heck is this cosmic tree? This mustard seed becoming this grand tree, and the it's very audacious. That his movement is like a mustard seed that becomes a grand tree, a cosmic, what's known as the world tree in Daniel 4 and Ezekiel 31, even that cosmic tree. Um, and sure enough, it starts with 12. Pentecost happens, bang, 3,000 saved, and then by the time you reach the 4th century, the whole Roman Empire, the whole Mediterranean is Christian. So that turned out to be true. But notice, theologically true, and even prophetically. Um, so here's where things get interesting. Um, Notice that, putting science aside for a moment, notice that Jesus doesn't even go out of his way to lay out the facts. Like, in other words, the question is saying, why couldn't he just dump like a handbook encyclopedia of all the known facts of nature, right? Bang. With all the equations and everything. You know what I would also do in the same vein? I would say, why didn't he just dump all the known theological facts of how he works, the Trinity, the mission, the plan of God in the Old Testament. But if we just dump it, why didn't he do that? Why, when you see how the narrative plays out, he's not even elaborating on theological matters, much less scientific matters. You know, in the text, you see even the disciples debating, what the heck does he mean by resurrection? You know, Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church, the Mount Hermon, the gates of hell rock. And by the way, Peter, I'm gonna go and get killed. No, Lord, that can't happen. And then, get behind me, Satan. Satan just means to oppose. Get behind me, you opposer. Um, when that question's raised, it's like, hey, it's not just the seismic details Jesus is withholding. It's also the theological details and a whole lot of other things. And then the journey, so sticking with theology, the journey of discovering, it's like, oh wow, look at that. With respect to the theology, and then that excitement that we have, hence something like Nicaea taking place, right? We see the same sort of journey scientifically. Let me just and then I'll conclude with this. This is how it starts. Okay, it just takes a little bit of a push uh, for the ball to start to roll. If you go to Galatians 4, um, because Paul is thinking of Genesis 1, and how I said Genesis 1 is a very natural, like atheistic type of text. It strips away all the superstition. So in Galatians 4, um, verse 4, when he speaks about, when the appropriate time had come, God sent his son, born by a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who are under the law, thus to adopt them as his children. Notice that just full blown, just very heavy theology, right? About Jesus and all that stuff. And now that we are his children, God sent a spirit of his son to cry out in the hearts, Abba Father and all that. So you're no longer a slave, but a child. And if you're a child, then you are also an heir because of what God did. And so then Paul, based on that theological truth that's now finally unraveled for him, because think about it. This is a little side tangent point. Go back to chapter 3 in Galatians. This will give you the psychology of Paul, why he's a Christian to begin with. Because see, if the theological truths were already there to begin with, why was Paul persecuting Christians? What was, in other words, why? In other words, well, yeah, like emphasize the question even more. Why was Paul persecuting Christians? Okay, Christians who are Jews at the time running around saying God became man, and then that God man was hung on a tree. Paul is like this ultra Orthodox Jew going, blasphemy, don't you say that. Because don't you know your Torah? In Deuteronomy 21 it says, if a man is hung on a tree, it's such a bad thing that's happened to him. It's like God has cursed him. So you're telling me Yahweh became a man and then Yahweh hang on a tree? That is stupid. Stop blaspheming my God, and then he had to stop this. So when you go to Galatians 3, notice he had to discover this. In fact, go all the way to chapter 1. He had remember when he says, um, when he says, uh, let's see here, when he says like he had to go away, like in verse 17, uh, you know, well, verse 15, but when God, who set me apart before I was born and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with another human being at any time, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were the apostles before me. Instead, I went to Arabia and then came back to Damascus. Then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Peter. Right? So Paul is having to rediscover, take some time out and just like learn what the heck is going, like reformulate everything, and it takes time. It's not instant. It's not like the Matrix where you just download it. It's like Trinity in the movie. It's like, Tank, I need to fly the chopper, bang, psh, and then she's able to fly the chopper. So that the sense of discovery is a beautiful thing. So then in Galatians 3, when you see this argument Paul makes, by the time you reach Galatians 3, notice in verse um uh, where is it? It's in verse I'll read from verse 10. So he goes, certainly all who depend on the actions of the law are under a curse. There's that curse language. And he quotes Deuteronomy 27, verse 26. For it is written, a curse on everyone who does not obey everything that is written in the book of the law. Okay? So notice he's an Orthodox Jew, he knows his Old Testament. Now it is obvious that no one is justified in the sight of God by the law because, and then he goes to the Old Testament, the righteous will live by faith. But the law has nothing to do with faith. Instead, the person who keeps the commandments will have life in them. And then he does something amazing. He goes, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. Now notice this, by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, and he goes back to the verse that caused him, the verse that made him persecute Christians. It's come back full circle. It's like, yeah, it's written, a curse on everyone who's hung on a tree. Deuteronomy 21 verse 23, right? But then in verse 14, he's like, this happened in order that the blessing promised to Abraham would come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. So it comes back full circle. He's like, oh my gosh. Going back to verse 13, Jesus redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. In other words, Jesus, who was hung on a tree, yes, he's in this sense he's cursed. But it's not just he's just cursed, like what the law says. Suddenly Paul's adding something new to what's already written. He became a curse, and then he adds two words, for us. Now that just literally upgrades and revolutionizes, and then it's the sensus planoa thing kicking in. Why didn't Jesus just lay it out right off the bat to begin with? No, notice this development even in the scriptures with respect to the theology, the same thing what we do in science. So now when you go to chapter 4, now that, because see, verses 4 to 7 is a summarization of the first three chapters, right? So then verse 8, it's more like application. And look at what he does. He goes, however, in the past, when you did not know God, literally in the Greek, you were atheists. You were slaves to things that are not really gods at all. Notice, I'll read that again. You were slaves to things that are not gods. What do you mean, Paul? He clarifies and he says, but now that you know God, or you've rather been known by God, how can you turn back to those powerless and bankrupt basic principles? Literally, in the Greek, you can translate this as the elemental spirits. But what does he mean by that? Why do you want to become the slaves all over again? And verse 10 is an explanation of what he's saying about this. They're not really gods. You are observing days, months, seasons, years. That verse 10 is in the Galatian context, is to do with the zodiac. It's to do with the sun, moon, and stars. In Greco-Roman religion, Zeus is Jupiter, right? The Olympian Jove, right? So notice, here you have a first century Jew who the atheists of today would say Paul is superstitious. But Paul is the one, the so-called superstitious Jew that believed in the resurrection, is the one who is speaking just like how you would speak, Richard Dawkins, saying that the sun is not some deity, the moon's not some deity, Jupiter, these are just natural objects in the night sky, and he's depending on Genesis 1 in that context. So, now notice how this is brilliant psychologically. If the known culture, which was the Greco-Roman culture at the time, is already superstitious, as Paul has already verified in his own writing that they are, how then can modern science develop out of that? It's a superstition, and that in that weird pagan sense, how can we come up with the technology to send satellites passing by Jupiter if you're believing that same object is Zeus? So isn't it interesting that here you have a religious text that readers of this text is then if someone were to reflect on this text, like what if Paul is true that that object is just a natural object? What would then happen psychologically? That would cause a snowball effect for then, in other words, if reality is natural, it leads to what we now know as a scientific method to kick in, and then the development of the scientific method and critical thinking kicks in, and then you realize just because some object falls down is not because of some demon pushing it down or some angel pushing it down or whatever. It's it you know it, we can There's an intelligibility to it that because of the logos concept, right? In the beginning is the logos, so there's a rationality to why things are, and then and it's because of the psychological encouragement that the scriptures give, the Christian scriptures give, that it's a snowball effect that leads to, because now notice Christianity becomes a worldwide religion, right? And then worldwide people are reading the stuff, which then further causes them to think critically. And then notice it so Western culture, you know, Christian Europe, science as a method, the peer review process, or like the Popper method. You don't try and prove your thesis, you try and disprove it. Like that comes from you know texts like this that ironically speak in the same tone as how, say, someone like Richard Dawkins would speak when he's frustrated with the non-critical thinking of superstitious people. How ironic that is, right? And and that's my answer to the question. It's not that there's this dumping down of knowledge on the scene, scientific knowledge, because when I look at the mustard seed and the tree, it's like, hey, that's true, uh, because it's about the church. And Jesus at the same time is withholding theological facts, just as he's withholding scientific facts. But then at the same time, psychologically, it's all there in the text and in the theology and the teachings and so on to bring about this, what Ephesians 3:10 says, this multifaceted wisdom of God, through the church is a vehicle by which, through the it's just progress, and it's always to God's glory, and so yeah, coming and then in conclusion, coming back to, say, the germ theory and stuff again. It now, I hate to say this, but now you're not you, but the the person asking the question is like, now you're that's a huge assumption on your part, because yes, modern medicine is helping with respect to like minimizing suffering you know from a virus germ stuff, right, in germ theory. But believe it or not, you're not giving enough credit then to an ancient culture who they had you know, their own like engagement with sickness and health, and the Bible is full of commands of how to go about with that. Highly revolutionized hygiene, practices, and I mean, just look at just the Levitical law code with respect to how the camp should be organized and the structure, and um, you know how many times you should wash yourself, and this is highly revolutionary for that culture, for that time. Um, so again, it's that tweaking, it's that fine tuning, like what to have in, what to have out. God is working with the community. Romans 8 principle, it all comes for good. Um, yeah, that would be the extent of how how to approach that question.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
no, very in depth explanation. Appreciate that. So, kind of in continuation of kind of like what we'd expect, and which is to say, like, okay, if you don't have this answer, like, if you don't have this prediction. That doesn't mean like you're wrong, but it's more of the question of like if we take a certain view and then we're able to take that view and then predict the future based off of like what actually happens, then some people would say that it's a more powerful model, and that kind of has to do with like what we did with I think you mentioned Genesis 120 or something along those lines with the fish and the birds, as far as predicting.
Mhm.
So it seems like this is what this person trying to do, which is so this is another one, which is the person says, never does the Bible even call or compare Earth to a ball, apple, or pomegranate or other spherical object. Like
Mhm.
like you would think that of all the things that like that'd be a perfect example, perfect way for concordism to be displayed when the Bible talks about like the earth and the shape of it, and what you would say is they saw a flat earth, but you've got that whole discussion there. So what do you think about that one?
Yeah, I again, the like I said, there's wholesale, like every detail of the known world, even the spherical nature of the Earth would be part of that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Again, what I'm saying is what I find interesting, what is included in the text, and what is excluded from the text. Another interesting exclusion would be the timing of everything. I find that to be very wise on God's part because you have other religious texts like the Hindu Vedas and so on that give an actual date of how old things are. Um, and But we know time is not static; it's dynamic. It changes. It age. Time keeps moving, ticking forward, right? So, if the Genesis creation account said the Earth is 4.5 billion years, that would be an outdated text a billion years from now. Um, so I find it curious that it doesn't say the age; it just says like long durations. And then that you know at, at like a billion years from now, if I read the same text, it's as true at the 5 billion year mark as it was in the 4 billion year mark. Um, it's the chronology of the events taking place. As far as the shape specifically, I find it curious that in Job especially. Now this is where it gets interesting because Job is not the you may have heard Job being it's the first book of the Bible. It predates Abraham, and no. The Job as a text is a it's within the exilic period, or even post-exilic, and in that period you start to and scholars who work on the emergence of the Hellenistic culture. So, for
Hey
example, the
Rob,
Septuagint. Yeah.
could you explain what the exilic period is for those that don't know?
So exilic is, say, the book of Daniel, Ezekiel when they're in Babylon. So they're in exile. That would be in
Gotcha.
the 500s to 600s
Mm-hmm.
BC period.
Okay.
Post that, say in the four, so Nehemiah, Ezra in the 400s, when the decree by Cyrus to rebuild Jerusalem starts, like that period. Then you have Alexander the Great in the 300s, and the Dead Sea Scrolls in like the 100s, 200s. So like in that 400-500 year range,
Mm-hmm.
just before Jesus, you start to then have discussions by astrologers, like say the Magi, wondering about the shape of the Earth. And now, cylinder seals, right? A cylinder seal is um, you know what we see as iconography, like overlapped on basically dried clay, right? But what they would do is they'd first draw all the shapes on the cylindrical thing and roll it on clay, and then you get the imprints of, say, a certain deity here, and so on, and then you get this iconographic picture. So for example, it's in Job 38 verse 14 and 15.
Okay.
So in Job 38:14 and 15 it says, like clay is molded on a signet ring, the earth's hills and valleys then stand out like the colors of a garment. Then from the wicked their light is withheld, and their upraised arm is broken. So now, um, to show you what's going on with respect to a signet ring here and the seal, so you're looking at something like, let's see here. This image here that I'm going to crop that, share this, something like this. Okay? Because see, notice the shadows. You know, when if you have light at a certain direction, you have like shadows and all that. And it's this imagery like, so going back to the verse, it says, the earth takes shape like clay under a seal, basically. Now, what gets even more interesting, oop, that didn't work. So let me just screenshot this and show it to you this way. This this seal over here is done because it's rolled in order to get this flattened shape like this. Now, isn't it interesting that if you're talking about Earth, right, and it's saying that like as the sun rises, it's like how the seal rotates, meaning the sunlight starts to appear over the mountains like this, like bang, bang, light starts to push forward, push forward, push forward. So what is actually moving? Is it the sun that's moving? But then I don't know, the text is like, it's the earth that does the rotating. Okay, here's where it gets interesting. Um, in that exilic period, you already had, believe it or not, you already had a proto-geocentric model of say the solar system, but this was the depiction of it. Let me get a photo of it here. This is it. In other words, this was a depiction of the solar system in Job's day. Why? Because Job is in the exilic period, post-exilic. But just before Job was Ezekiel, who wrote in the exilic period, right? And you know the wheels within wheels in Ezekiel 1? Well, this is what Ezekiel's describing because of the Babylonian zodiac. Notice you have a spherical earth, and the living creatures that Ezekiel's describing are the zodiacal signs that are like on a wheel. And then when Ezekiel says the eyes cover the body of these living creatures, the Hebrew word for eye can mean star. So the stars cover each of these bodies. But
That's super fascinating.
yeah, they had like a geocentric model, and scholars who specialize in the very early Proto-Greek formulations of a spherical Earth is around this time. So the fact that the text even speaks about like light starts to appear on top of the mountains, like as if, in other words, just like how a cylinder sail rolls, it's like the Earth is rotating. How can a flat Earth do that? So you already now notice that there is no spherical Earth mentioned in Genesis 1, and I'm fine with that because again the as you go back to the early books of the Bible, you're going back in time. You're going back to a more primitive form of cosmology and science, and hence the type of polemics involved has to accommodate that, while, according to my thought experiment, it's trying to stay as cutting edge as possible. And as you progress through, by the time you reach uh, more sophisticated understandings of reality. Naturally so. You'll have statements in Job or whatever that are more like advanced than whatever the Genesis author wrote. Um, and here's another thing. I know Christians will immediately run to Isaiah 40. You know, this the circle of the earth. Guess what? Isaiah had the means to use ball, and it actually occurs only one time in Isaiah, specifically the Hebrew word for ball. That's in chapter 22. I think verse 19, somewhere around there, where he speaks about like a ball being rolled. He could have said he could have used that word. Oh, and if he did, amazing if he did. But we have to be honest with what is in the text. It says circle, which
Right.
is that ancient Near Eastern circular earth thing. So all I'm suggesting is, yes, it would be fascinating. Okay, notice this. This is gonna make you go, oh, okay. Say if he did use the ball that he used in Isaiah 22 for that verse in Isaiah 40, right? But don't forget, he's a 7th century writer. Or say if Moses used that word in Exodus or something, that would actually be counterproductive. Like if it was just plainly said, you know, the spherical earth or the ball or the earth is a ball, how on earth would that now you're alienating the culture. Notice again the thought experiment I said it's a very I've been thinking about this very deeply, like trying to imagine what would happen if I actually went into that culture. If I went and spoke with Moses and said the earth is a sphere, now I've alienated the culture. Um, if Isaiah used that word for ball, he's 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 now gone beyond the parameters of what's required to communicate a clear message. The whole so-called like perspicuity of scripture, right? The clarity of scripture. Now you've flunked out Isaiah. Now um, so what's left out is important, believe it or not. Like things like these questions, like why can't it just mention ball? Well, to us it sounds like so easy, but it's a paradigm shift, you know, if Genesis 1 were to mention it. So what's left out is important, and what's left in is important. So it's a fine tuning and tweaking that then by the time you reach later books, it sort of like adds and elaborates a little bit more than actually. Okay, let me give you this one example to speak about this elaboration that the later books elaborate. Go to Psalm 104. This is David. David's needing to respond to the Atum creation hymn, the Egyptian creation hymn that's dedicated to Atum. So all David needs is let the best creation model win, right? So he has Genesis 1 as it's there to be used, right? Now, if you go now notice this. This is just amazing. If you go to verses 6 to 9 of Psalm 104, um, David says, well, if you go to verse 5, so we know what the context is. So it says, see, he says, he established the earth on its foundations so that it never falters. So in this context, it's talking about day 1 of Genesis 1, that the earth, even though it's unformed and desolate, but it's there, right? He continues with respect to day 1, because see, Genesis 1 verse 2 speaks about how the whole earth is covered, right? So he's like, look, you covered the primeval ocean like a garment, the water stood above the mountains. Okay. But when you go to Genesis 1, and when you see it on day 3 where it mentions the, landmass, it's just a very generic, and then there was land, and God called it land. Let the water come in one place, let dry ground come in one place, and oceans, land. That's it. Obviously, a more sophisticated scientific um, explanation would be, it would be thousands of pages of geophysical research on the, tectonic uplift and blah 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 blah. And again, what's left out is important, and what's left in is important. But David starts to elaborate more. In other words, he adds on top of what Genesis 1 is saying. So he's like, look, yeah, you did cover the primeval ocean like a garment, but then how? But he elaborates more on that, like land rising and waters going to one place, by saying this. He goes, they flee at your rebuke, they rush away at the sound of your thunders. Mountains rise up, valleys sink to the place you have ordained for them. You've set a boundary they cannot cross, the water cannot cross, and they, which is the water, will never again cover the earth. And do you see how he's saying things like mountains rising and valleys sinking, something that Genesis 1 doesn't say, but he's using his intellect to go, but that's exactly what happens. It has to happen that way. Um, and ironically enough, this passage also clarifies for the all Earth creationists like you, Rust, that the flood can't be global, because if David is talking about a fixed nature of the boundaries, right, which is the continents, right? Um, then, and by the way, it's not like David knew about the continents. It's, he knew about the shorelines and so on. But the point is, David would be aware of the global flood, of the global flood that would come later. So how can you say they'll never get across the earth, David? Because don't you know, when the flood happens, the whole world becomes flooded. So there's a subtle little insight, like David is polemically engaging the Egyptian creation hymn, and at the same time commentating on Genesis 1, and at the same time, if we take Scripture seriously, that there can't be any contradictions in Scripture. If you believe in a global flood, David has made a faux pas. He's made a mistake in verse 9. So if I take David by, like, if I take it, infallibly, I have to, then it's my interpretation of Genesis 6 to 9 that needs to be reevaluated. And sure enough, there's scholars that'll show that when you actually look at the Hebrew in the flood account, it doesn't read as a global flood, and so therefore no problem there.
So, so previously we had a couple questions of like what we'd expect, what we expect to see, but not choose to say those. But he would choose to say these specific things about like Genesis 1 evolution, like why, in the past 200 years, why would we need to put, you know, 2022 science in it? Why would God want to put our our 2022 view of
Or
science
21st
into the
century
Bible?
science, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, no, 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 but it's not, no, but he's not doing that. We are discovering um, the truth of and the fact of reality. It's not that, again, if we were living in the 15th century and we went the concordus route in that very like weird, wrong way of going about it, you can ask the same question: why is God putting 15th century science in? No. The fact is, nature exists, and the fact is, this nature has um, its own rules. You and I, we are just discovering it, and we're formulating theories as to how it works and why it works, and we can make predictions and all that. In other words, we're like manipulating, nature, but we're finite, error-prone creatures, and we're not perfect. It's the pursuit of truth. So, okay, that being said, if the book of nature, so Jeremiah 31, Jeremiah 33, has God saying, I've made a covenant with the laws of nature. And in fact, Jeremiah 33 says the fixed laws. This is in verse 24, 25, around there. The fixed laws of nature. So it's fixed. Um, that means um, in some sense, nature's like an infallible thing. Because again, the principle of Romans 1:20, it's like if nature wasn't infallible, then why would Paul say we can through nature understand God's invisible attributes? In other words, the immutability of God, just like nature is immutable, it doesn't change. It's regular, right? Regulation of nature. God doesn't change, right? So, in other words, we can trust nature and the fabric of the cosmos in some sense with respect to understanding God. Wow. So it's not just the Bible. It's because God's the creator of nature, just as He's also the creator of the Bible. Um, so we're not shoving in 21st century ideas into the Bible. What we're doing is, it's a fact. The Bible exists, and the Bible has its own context. And in fact, each book has its own context. And you see an evolution of the context, right? For example, Ezekiel 1 with the wheels and so on, uniquely Babylonian. You don't need to regurgitate weird wheel stuff in Nehemiah. What's the need? You know? So each book has its own unique cultural context. And so then you see like an evolution of human thinking and psychology and knowledge and all that through each book. And God's working with each book. But the fact is, you have the fact, the big T truth of everything, which is only associated with God Himself and whatever like hypostasis He may have with, in other words, say nature itself. Um, and then if you have an account, now think about this, if you have an account like Genesis 1, going out of its way to even give a chronological overview of the history of things that have come and gone, why? I mean, think about it. But let's put aside concordism and all that stuff, right? Why even have a historical account of on this day this happened, on this day this happened? What's the point? Um, unless those things did happen in natural history, and the text is trying to first and foremost, again, be a polemic with respect to ancient Near Eastern creation myths, but at the same time, because of the fact that 13.8 billion years of universal history transpires and all these epochs take place, that now, in hindsight of that fact that we're discovering, it's not some theory we're making up scientifically in the 21st century, and it's a fact of reality that we're then going, does it match the biblical text? And oh, look, it does. Um, like, I hope that answers the question, but yeah.
Yeah, and of course, you've kind of, we some of these questions are kind of repeating same focus,
Yeah.
same topic. So,
Mm.
like, there's no reason to repeat 100 different things you've already said before. So,
Yeah.
um, all right. So this is an interesting one. It seems like the Bible was given specifically for special revelation,
Yeah. Right.
and or the concordance, it seems like, is trying to put it more than that. That it's also trying to put general revelation there too.
Yeah, special revelation is directly that's when God directly, it's that whole theopneustos process. It's that direct. In other words, so special revelation is when it's God introducing information that you can't derive from the natural world. That's why it's a very careful differentiation between general revelation and special. The Bible is quote unquote special because look, it's still the general revelation and the general natural realities of pen and paper and human minds putting it all together. It's a human book, um, and human drama and human this and that, and also to some extent a supernatural sense, right? The angels and all that. But it becomes special because God's the one, localizing his an ultimate timeless message only in this book. And um, when we here's the thing: special revelation doesn't trump general revelation. I hate it when some Christians sort of like they try and put one on top of the other. If that's the case, then God's fighting against himself. Like in other words, if the Bible trumps the natural world, notice the presupposition in that. It's like, because see, the natural world is fallen. See that, you see this in young earth circles. Natural world is fallen and it's subject to sin and blah blah. And yeah, guess what? Genesis 1 is not shy to say that. It starts with chaos comf. It starts with chaos, struggle with chaos. There's a Leviathan monster in verse 21 of Genesis. So from 20, when it speaks of birds and fish, 21 speaks about the Tanin, the Leviathan figure, the chaos monster. The King James calls it like a great whale. Um, you know, like later on when humans come on the scene, subdue the earth, rule, all very, harsh terms. Um, this language of multiply, fill the earth. Why? If everyone's living forever, why in just before the fall this language of procreation? What? Because there's thermodynamics, there's decay, there's death. Guess what? Psalm 104, when David's talking about Genesis 1, he speaks about death happening in Genesis 1. God replenishing the surface. So, um, yeah. So all I'm saying is understand special revelation in first century Christianity just meant the moment you have like look at the way Hebrews 1 starts. God in fragmentary times before spoke in fragmentary ways, but now has spoken, through his son. Like that is special revelation. Uh, but at the same time, does this mean when everyone spoke generically and generally about things, like a Romans 1:20 moment, that's sort of like just guesswork because it's fallible? No, that's just God's truth is always at 100% bandwidth everywhere on it with respect to no matter the discussion. But then what solidifies it is Jesus. Hence the specialness of that particular revelation. Um, that's my approach to that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Uh, Another interesting one. So, um, once again, coming about like what we would expect. We would expect God to make this revelation of something that um, maybe even a specific genre of literature in the Bible was, you know, not futuristic, but scientific literature. Like, uh, there's a lot of people that are like, "Hey, Genesis is it's mythic literature, mythic history," as one like Craig says it. Um, so just like that, like we would expect a scientific literature kind of genre, and obviously you're going to disagree.
No,
No.
I think Craig's, mytho history stuff, I'm completely fine with those terms. All I'm saying is, Craig, you just call you're saying the same thing with just a different more fancy word, mytho history. Uh, because that just goes right in line again with polemic stuff, ancient Near Eastern polemics, and um, and then Craig at the same time in his book on the historical Adam, he still, ends up with basically a concordance model. That what the text says about an atom is actually there in the in human anthropology. Now, I personally wouldn't put Adam at 600,000 years ago or something like what Craig does. My view is Genesis 1 doesn't mention the geography of where humans arise. It just says humans plural. Human anthropology specifically says in East Africa about 200, 250,000, like the modern Homo sapiens. But notice this: Genesis 2 has the text saying that God places man in the east. putting him in the garden, which means at one time they were outside it, which is Genesis 1. And Walton is saying this now, okay? Now, I find this really amazing. The Concordus, like Hugh Ross, will say Genesis 2 is a telescoping of day 6. But that harms the Concordus model, ironically enough. And this is something I've told Hugh, and I don't know if he's changing his view, but like Hugh, if you say Genesis 2 is a telescoping of day 6 of Genesis 1, you do have contradictory statements. Walton comes on the scene and without even realizing it, is acting like a concordist. And Walton says Genesis 1 ends in verse 4 of Genesis 2. And Genesis 2 begins, but as a sequel, not a telescoping or like a repeat of Genesis 1, but as an actual sequel, meaning the story continues from verse 5 onwards. And that's important because if it's a sequel, that means the humans of Genesis 1 are not the Adam and Eve people of Genesis 2. Because people like Hugh Ross like to think of the humans in Genesis 1 as being actually just Adam and Eve, and that's it, just two people. Whereas people like Seth Postel and all these others will point out, no, we're talking about a large population growing. And then by the time you reach Genesis 2, so from 250,000 years, and then it says he's placing man in the east. Well, what's east of Africa? The Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, right? So then by the time you have human migration into this oasis of the Persian Gulf, and there wasn't, by the way, there was no Persian Gulf water. It was all one big dry oasis. Um, then Seth Postel's work comes into play. Then you have a high priest, Adam and Eve, as before God, representing all humans. And then when Adam and Eve fall, all humans fall, just like Postel will say, Adam is Israel. If a king in Israel fell, all of Israel fell. Um, so notice then how ironic Walton is being the concordist with that interpretation, Genesis 2. Um, and because he's helping the case that there's actual history playing out chronologically, um, with human migration and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
super cool. That's super cool. Hmm. Uh, so this is the last one, and I'd say the best.
Okay.
Rob, you're super selfish for wanting to say the Bible speaks to you in a special way that no one before or even in other cultures would benefit or understand. What you say, Rob?
I'm going to quote Hugh Ross over here, and I think he says something here that I think um, I'll share my screen what he says here, and I think um, it might surprise you, um, or the questioner.
And just to be
Uh,
clear, just to be
mhm,
clear, I laughed not because it was like a bad question or anything like
mhm.
that, but just because the awkwardness of saying that you're wrong, Rob.
Mm. Well, look, I don't claim to be 100% right, because that would be against my my constant declaration of having scientific humility, of always testing, right, and renewing the mind, right. So this isn't Hugh Ross's Matter of Days, right? And over here, he gives this typical the point of view of Genesis 1, right? And look what he says. He's like, look, with the point of view fixed on Earth's surface, the description of Earth's dark, formless, and empty initial conditions makes sense. Earth's primordial atmosphere and the solar system's primordial interplanetary debris prevent the light of the sun, moon, stars from reaching the planet. So this is everything I've just been sharing, right? Earth was empty of life and unfit for life because life requires sunlight. Now, I find this really fascinating, and I checked it out. This interpretation of the text, its viewpoint, looking up at initial conditions and perspective on the prior existence of the sun, moon, and stars, becoming visible on the fourth day, dates back to the era before modern science, at least back to the late 1600s. Old Testament scholar and Hebrew linguist Gleason Archer offered this perspective in 1955, well before Hugh Ross came on the scene with RTV and concordism. I gave you that example of Sailhammer, Robert Newman, John Snow, Herman Eckelmann, William Henry Green, Daniel Wanderley, all advanced degrees in science, theology, or both, published a similar interpretation of Genesis 1 in 1977. It is neither new nor novel, and it makes sense. Again, Hugh's tackling the issue in this context. I even went further, wondering, let's go even further back, using, say, the bird fish stuff. Um, so coming back to that question, it's like, how could I be accused of that when I'm actually being, ironically, the one open to correction by investigating the data and what people were also saying, obviously not wholesale buying into what they're saying. In other words, I'm collecting, you know, discussions and ideas and perspectives that were being thrown out and questions. Because see, the primary text is the Bible, and then everything else is secondary literature, right? And I'm noticing that, again, coming back to the fish bird stuff, how interesting. Scientists who don't know that Basil said what he said presume that Darwin was the first to speak about the that birds and fish are related. Looks like Basil beat him to that, because Basil, based on the text, is wondering if there's a unified family relationship between birds and fish. Um, so we're all in this together, is what I'm saying. It's that principle of God's wisdom being unfolded. Ephesians 3:10. Um, you know, um, it's also the cry of the Reformation to keep being reformed, keep renewing the mind, keep testing. Um, the moment someone says, "No, I know what's going on," yeah, all these other people have made these claims, but I'm ultimately the one that you should rely on. Now you're talking about a cult, and God forbid I ever, present myself in that context, or anyone. Like Heiser would say the same thing. Don't, Hugh Ross says the same thing. Don't follow me. Like I'm some guru. No, this is just a simple paragraph here shows this is a discussion that's been going on by many intelligent people. Um, and it's not just one guy that has a monopoly on the data. It's a team effort, and and how interesting Jesus still comes out on top in that investigation. So yeah,
Awesome. All right, yep, that's all I got for you, Rob. I really appreciate you coming on here and explaining your views. I think this will help a lot of people. Yeah, could you? So you have your channel. We're going to link that in the description. You have a website. Anything else you would want to share?
yeah. Sentinel Apologetics. There's also the blog. Join the Discord community. Actually, the Discord community is really growing. I'm really thankful for, providentially, the, I suppose, fans of Sentinel that have, like, because I as far as that side of technology goes, I suck. So I don't know how to, make all those fancy weird server designs, and like people over the years. Oh, actually, just a few, well, last couple of years really. Um, as more has come in, and as fans, and they want to help, they're like, I'm like, hey, look, treat the server as like your community really, because it's all of you guys, and yeah, so come into that server, like, it's a home where I frequently give updates, like Mark study updates and all that, and
Yeah, do
Yeah,
like little Bible studies
yeah, yeah. Sometimes, yeah.
on the server. Yep. Cool. All right. Well, once again, appreciate you, Rob, and thanks for coming on. I'll see you later.
Thank you, man. God bless you.
Yes, sir.